The subcommittee will now come to order. Thank you for closing the door. The chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes. Today we continue the subcommittee's oversight of the Superfund cleanup program, and we initiate a discussion with the EPA and other stakeholders about ways to modernize the program to make sure that the Superfund sites around the country are getting cleaned up and returned to productive use in the most efficient and effective manner. The Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, commonly referred to as CERCLA, also known as quote-unquote Superfund, was signed into law on December 11, 1980. The National Priorities List came into existence in 1983, and it is the prioritization of sites with known releases or threatened releases of hazardous substances throughout the United States. As of November 2017, there were over 1,300 sites on the National Priorities List, and many of the sites have been on the list for more than 20 years. The process of evaluating contamination at the site and determining the appropriate remedy can take years or even decades, which delays the cleanup of the site and prevents the area from being returned to productive use, which is why today's hearing is so important. We applaud Administrator Pruitt for making Superfund cleanups a priority because he correctly noted that cleanups take too long to start and too long to complete. To improve the efficiency and efficacy of the Superfund program, EPA developed an extensive list of recommendations to restructure the cleanup process and make sure that responsible parties and other stakeholders are fully engaged in the process. I would like to welcome Mr. Breen, the Principal Deputy Assistant Administrator for the Office of Land and Emergency Management, who will hopefully be able to share with us information about the efforts undertaken by the agency to expedite cleanups and reinvigorate redevelopment. We hope that today will be a start of a productive dialogue about the Superfund cleanup program and how we can all work together to make sure that the program results in timely and efficient cleanups. When CERCLA was enacted, very few states had their own cleanup programs, whereas today all states have robust and successful programs. We need to assess whether states should have a more significant role in CERCLA cleanups and whether there are cleanups that are best handled entirely by the states. Furthermore, there is a lot of process involved in CERCLA cleanups. We need to take a serious look at whether that process is working or whether it encourages or impedes cleanups. To help us with this analysis, we welcome our second panel. We welcome back Mr. Cobb from the state of Alabama, who is here on behalf of a good friend of the subcommittee at SWAMO. Mr. Cobb is the head of the Land Division in Alabama and will hopefully talk to us about how far states have come with developing cleanup programs and whether the current role for states in CERCLA cleanups is appropriate. We also welcome Mr. Porter, who is the former head of the EPA's Office of Solid Waste and Emergency Response. Mr. Porter has been in the trenches at EPA with respect to CERCLA cleanups, and hopefully he can share with us his ideas and suggestions for making the program work better. We also have with us today Jim McKenna, who comes from us from the Governor Brown's office in Oregon, who I personally met on my trip to that Superfund site with our colleague a couple months ago. Mr. McKenna has over 30 years of experience working with the Superfund cleanup program, and we welcome his suggestions for modernizing the program both in the state and responsible party perspective. And last but not least, we will hear from Catherine Probst, who truthfully wrote a detailed report on how to improve the Superfund program, and Ms. Manns, who is part of the Community Advisory Group for the Passaic River, I should know that, Superfund site in New Jersey, which was listed on the National Priorities List in 1984. So hopefully she will have some productive suggestions for us how to make the program work better. So we welcome everyone. Is Mr. Carter? Mr. Carter, you want to take my last minute to do your introduction?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to recognize that you've already mentioned Dr. Porter, Dr. Winston Porter, who is here. He happens to reside in my district, and I appreciate him being here very much. He's very familiar with the 4 Superfund sites that we have in our district, and we appreciate that. As you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, he was the EPA's Assistant Administrator with national responsibility for the Superfund program. We're very pleased to have him here and appreciate his expertise and him sharing it with us. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back to me, and I yield back my time. Chair now recognizes the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Tonko from New York, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for holding this hearing on modernizing EPA's Superfund program. And thank you, Mr. Breen, for being here. Appreciate you being here. However, I'm disappointed that Albert Kelly, who led the Superfund task force, is not with us. It is critical that we hear from the agency's political leadership on this and other important issues. In 1980, Congress passed the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, which is most commonly known as Superfund. Superfund is critical to protecting Americans' health and the environment. It is estimated that over 50 million Americans live within 3 miles of a Superfund site. Today, there are over 1,300 sites listed on the National Priorities List. These represent many of the most contaminated sites in our country. There is no question that remediation of these sites is complex. There are many reasons why cleanups are slow and are often delayed, and I believe many members would be interested in examining what changes are needed to the program to ensure that it operates more effectively moving forward. But we cannot discount the importance of funding and the need for robust engagement with stakeholders and the people that live near these sites. Administrator Pruitt has said remediating these sites is a top priority. However, the President's fiscal year 2018 budget request proposed a 30% cut to the program. The EPA has also proposed eliminating financial support for the Justice Department's Environment and Natural Resources Division. EPA provides this office with 27% of its budget, which is used to support Superfund efforts. Superfund has always been based on the principle of the polluters pay. Responsible parties should foot the bill to clean up contaminated sites, not our taxpayers. But it is critical that EPA has the resources to hold responsible parties accountable, as well as ensure remediation of orphan sites. Similarly, Superfund can only succeed with public buy-in. Rushing to delete sites without engaging stakeholders or failing to alleviate their concerns that a site is not adequately remediated will undermine the integrity of the program, as well as its ability to complete meaningful cleanups. As we will hear this morning, Administrator Pruitt has taken actions related to Superfund. In July, the Superfund Task Force released its report with 42 recommendations, and last month, EPA published a list of 21 sites targeted for immediate, intense action. I have questions and concerns about how these recommendations and priorities have been developed. These cases are yet additional data points in an unacceptable pattern of behavior. This administration's aversion to transparency and public input is well noted. In the case of the targeted list, the task force's own recommendation was not even closely followed. As far as I am aware, there was no method released publicly for determining site selection. And it seems to me that sites where human exposure is not under control were not sufficiently prioritized. It appears that many of these sites do not have much in common with one another. According to the questions and answers document on EPA's website, they were, at least partially, chosen because they have upcoming critical milestones, and the intent is to have sites added and removed from this list going forward. I'm not convinced that cycling sites through a meaningless list and churning out press releases celebrating milestones are going to result in these sites being cleaned up more quickly. So far, this list has only raised more questions and caused confusion with stakeholders. As always with Superfund, members will have questions about sites of great interest to them. For the people of my district, that means the Hudson River. I'm very concerned about the status of the site. EPA's draft second 5-year review concluded that today, the Upper Hudson fails to meet the minimum standard for Superfund cleanup, protection of human health and the environment. The draft review concluded that EPA expects the site to be protective at some point in the very distant future, 55 years or more, although that assumption seems tenuous. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and New York State have all challenged EPA's timeline for achieving the remediation goals and the adequacy of the cleanup. The communities I represent have already waited a lifetime to see this river and its rich heritage restored. They should not have to wait another 5 or 6 decades as a best-case scenario. The federal government has a responsibility to ensure that the Hudson River is indeed protected. So I encourage EPA to reevaluate the draft review. Finally, I want to emphasize that rolling back environmental protections and reducing enforcement actions will ensure that we continue to add sites to the national priorities list in the future. I hope we can consider Superfund's role in the context of the agency's broader plan to protect human health and the environment. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. As the chair waits for the chairman of the full committee, I would like to turn to the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Pullen, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for calling this hearing on the Superfund program, which is a critical public health program that's made an enormous difference in my state and nationwide. It is essential that this committee conduct oversight of the controversial and frankly confounding implementation decisions being made by President Trump, Administrator Pruitt, and the rest of the political leadership at EPA. In the past month, this administration has published not one, but two new lists of Superfund sites with no public process and no clear explanation of how sites were chosen or will be impacted. And neither of these lists focuses on the riskiest sites, calling into question this administration's commitment to cleaning up the most toxic sites poisoning communities around this country. Unfortunately, we do not have anyone from EPA's political leadership here today to answer our questions. And Mr. Chairman, this administration has gone to extraordinary lengths to avoid transparency with the public and with Congress. And I repeatedly raised these concerns with you and Chairman Walden, and I have to raise them again today. EPA did not send a single witness to testify before this committee until November. Last month, Administrator Pruitt appeared for the first time a full 10 months after taking office, and at that hearing he pledged to provide witnesses for future hearings and to respond to our oversight requests. Well, over a month has passed since he appeared, and we have received no additional responses to our oversight requests. And despite the promise of Albert Kelly testifying today, we're now told he had to back out because of unavoidable conflicts. Now, strangely, these conflicts appeared very recently, despite EPA being apprised of this hearing some 2 months ago. Mr. Chairman, I believe Mr. Kelly's unavoidable conflicts have nothing to do with scheduling and everything to do with his troubling financial ties. Mr. Kelly owes this committee and the public a thorough explanation of his past misdeeds, an explanation that EPA's career staff cannot provide. Public office is a public trust, and that's especially true for the Superfund program. Billions of dollars move to the Superfund Trust Fund and the Superfund Special Accounts, money that can mean the difference between a toxic environment and a safe one for communities around the country. And Mr. Kelly, who Administrator Pruitt pledged in charge of these funds, or placed, I should say, in charge of these funds, was just this past year banned for life from working in any federally insured bank or financial institution. He was banned for life because of his unfitness to serve and his willful or continuing disregard for the safety and soundness of the bank for which he worked. Is that really the type of person we should trust to run the Superfund program? In September, I wrote to EPA to ask for an explanation. And of course, like so many other inquiries made to this EPA, there's been no response. When we first learned that Mr. Kelly would skip this hearing, we urged you to postpone for good cause. Mr. Kelly appears to be running the Superfund program single-handedly and generating no records. He's the only one who can answer questions about the decision he has made. This hearing should have been postponed until he was available. That didn't happen, so now we should schedule another hearing, and the committee should use all of its available tools to ensure that Mr. Kelly appears. All I'm saying is that we must hold this administration accountable, but that's not happening with this Republican majority. Cleaning up toxic Superfund sites protects human health and the environment. We must move past the press releases to protect the Superfund program and all the essential laws that the EPA implements. And I just hope in this new year, I would hope we can move forward together in our oversight efforts. I just think this program is too important, Mr. Chairman. The EPA is too important. We can't accept this administration's lack of transparency, and we can't accept the appointment of people who do not deserve, in my opinion, the public's trust. And I yield back unless someone else wants some of my time, but I don't think so. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair's looking for the chairman who has not arrived. Anyone else? Majority. The chair recognizes a gentlelady from Tennessee for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to applaud the EPA's back-to-basics approach and Administrator Pruitt's commitment to focus on the agency's core mission. I think these are steps in the right direction. And to stay within the bounds of constitutional law and to cut unnecessary bureaucracy. And I will tell you, in Tennessee, my constituents talk about the work that's being done to cut regulation and bureaucracy. They like these steps. Now, in Tennessee, there are 28 Superfund sites. 4 are on the national priorities list, and they are in my district. So this is something that we focus on. You need to clean up these contaminated sites. There is no question about it, and I will tell you, I have questions about the amount of process and the foot dragging that is involved in cleaning up these sites under CERCLA. Bids for these sites should not be taking 15 or 20 years. That would be common sense. We know that process has to speed up. Administrator Pruitt has said a couple of things. Back last June at an appropriations hearing, he made a comment. It's more about decision-making leadership than management, and management than money. Excuse me, I got that quote wrong. It's more about decision-making leadership and management than money. I agree with him on that. As I said, it ought not to take 15 or 20 years. At our oversight hearing in December, he said, most of it is a lack of direction on how we should clean up. So these are solvable problems. Communities want to see these sites cleaned up. They want to see the problem solved. So we all know it is possible to do more with less. The private sector does this every single day, and it is time for government to start to do more with less and to do it in a more timely fashion and time-efficient manner. Let's be responsible to the states, to the communities, and to the parties that are involved in this process, and let's speed this up and get these cleanup efforts in gear. And I will yield, Mr. Chairman, to whomever would like the time, or yield it back.
It looks like you could yield it back, and we'd
I
be
yield
great.
back.
Generally yields back our time, and we appreciate that. All time having expired, the chair now recognizes the first panel, Mr. Barry Breen, Principal Deputy Assistant Administrator for the Office of Land and Emergency Management, U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Before the hearing, he and I spoke. We both served in the Army at the same time, so thank you for your service, and you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Shimkus, and thank you, Ranking Member Tonko and Ranking Member Pallone. Thank you, all the members of the subcommittee. We're grateful to be here and to answer your questions. The Superfund program is a premier example of how we can both protect the environment and pursue economic development at the same time. The importance of Superfund to human health is highlighted in recent academic research by faculty at Princeton University, the University of Chicago, and the University of California at Berkeley. Superfund cleanups reduce the incidence of congenital abnormalities, birth defects, in infants by as much as 25% for families living within 2,000 meters of a site. At the same time, Superfund is important to economic development. Faculty at Duke University and the University of Pittsburgh found that increased residential property values within 3 miles of Superfund sites go up between 18 and 24% when the sites are cleaned up and deleted from the NPL. Superfund responds to both short-term emergencies and long-term remedial action needs. Each year, about 30,000 calls come into the National Response Center, and many of these are best handled by state and local responders. But EPA works with our Coast Guard partners in responding to roughly 150 to 200 of these releases each year. EPA has a 24-hour response capability, and for the last 11 years, EPA completed or oversaw 3,600 and some response actions. At the same time as those short-term emergencies are being dealt with, the Superfund remedial program addresses complex, high-priority, long-term cleanups. They reflect both legacy practices from decades ago and more recent contamination as well. Through 2017, EPA and our partners completed final remedial assessments at more than 51,000 potentially contaminated sites. But at the same time much has been done, there's much left to do. And we've taken several steps to further improve and expedite the process of site remediation. The administrator established a Superfund task force to provide recommendations on an expedited timeframe. The task force report provides 42 recommendations, and we adopted it in July. We included a list, as Mr. Tonko mentioned, of the 21 sites for immediate and intense attention. In developing the list, we considered sites that would benefit from the administrator's direct engagement and have identifiable actions to protect human health and the environment. We wanted to spur action at sites where opportunities exist to act quickly. Sites will move on and off the list as appropriate. We also recently released an initial list of Superfund sites with the greatest expected redevelopment and potential for commercial development. These are where we think there's been previous outside interest, access to transportation corridors, land values, and similar development drivers. It's not a complete list of everything with redevelopment potential, and we hope sites will move on and off the list as appropriate. And we're addressing risk at all Superfund sites, not just to those on the list. The administrator's expectation is a renewed focus on accelerating work in progress at all sites nationwide. We appreciate your interest in our program. Protecting human health and the environment by enhancing ongoing cleanup and reuse remains one of EPA's top priorities. Such efforts will be always undertaken in partnership with other federal departments and agencies, states, tribes, and local communities in a manner that protects human health and the environment and seeks economic development as well. Thank you very much, and I'll look forward to your questions.
I thank the gentleman, and now we'll turn to the round of questions, and I'll start with recognizing myself 5 minutes for the first member to speak. First of all, welcome. We're glad to have you here, and just to put this in perspective, a long-time career professional employee from the EPA. We appreciate your service, and that gives us a pretty good insight into, you've seen a lot over the years. I want to thank Administrator Pruitt and the EPA for making Superfund cleanup program a priority. I think most members, if we don't have a Superfund site in our district, we have one close enough, and we've been bedeviled by this process, as you all have been for decades. And that's the frustration that you will hear from members who've been on the committee for a long time, just how long this takes, the cost it takes, the parties involved, and those issues. Would you please walk us through what you view as the most important issues that need to be addressed to make the program more effective and more efficient?
Thank you. In fact, we asked ourselves those questions when we put together the task force over the summer and developed the 42 recommendations. The way the recommendations were developed was by asking senior career staff, for the most part, what we should do, and we all listened as well to outside input. But in the end, it was the task force that put the recommendations together and provided it to the administrator in June on about the 30-day timeline he'd asked for. Then there was interaction with the administrator, and then we came out with the report as reflected in July. So I'd have to say what we would reflect back are what's in the task force report. For one thing, it's looking for hindrances that can be moved aside. Things were put in place for a reason at one time, but that time may well have passed. We want to focus on demonstrable outcomes like construction completion, getting site-wide ready for anticipated use. We want sites deleted when they can be safely. We want to get the work done. So I would turn us to those 42 recommendations as what I would suggest as the consensus view.
Thank you. The state cleanup programs, when I had the history of the Superfund in my opening statement, that's what I was pulling out. It enacted in 1980, the National Priority List in 1983. There are still sites on that list that haven't been remediated, which is, again, I think embarrassing from a national government perspective. Having said that, what has evolved and what is different is state involvement in cleanup and cleanup actions. Would cleanups be more efficient if certain Superfund CERCLA authorities were delegated to the states?
Thank you. So let me start by saying we, at least from our perspective, have a very strong relationship with the states, and we appreciate it. And in fact, we couldn't accomplish nearly enough without that strong relationship. We have a baseline already of many sites not being addressed on the Superfund National Priorities List because states are addressing them under state programs. And in many cases, we have formal agreements to that end, and in other cases, we have strong working relationships that don't need a formal agreement. But there are indeed probably thousands of sites that are not on the National Priorities List thanks to strong state programs. In order for a site to get on the National Priorities List, our practice is to ask states for their concurrence before putting it on the list. And indeed, many of the filtering and screening and site assessment work that leads to a site being put on the NPL are actually accomplished by state programs. And so, in fact, we've, for one recent year, like 2017, we provided $58 million to states in total, both to conduct activities on NPL sites and to support state Superfund programs. Where states are undertaking work on their own, the statute already provides that states have the same ability that the EPA does to recover costs from polluters. And so Superfund is a response statute. It involves men and women working on the ground. We'd be ready to talk further about ways we can work together. But I wouldn't want to miss the reality that the strong working relationship is already making a big difference.
And in my short time remaining, does the National Contingency Plan need to be updated and modernized to more effectively deal with sites that are being cleaned up?
Thank you. We recently amended the hazard ranking system to account for subsurface intrusion. This is the TCE typically, or other halogenated solvents that can move with the water through the groundwater and then come up into homes and basements. We recently amended the hazard ranking system to address that. In terms of other NCP amendments, we'd be open and to discussion. I know it's not just Superfund, but the oil program as well in the NCP.
I want to thank you, and I'll now recognize the ranking member subcommittee, Mr. Tonko, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Breen, how does the EPA consider concerns from the public, from peer agencies, states, and independent scientists in its 5-year review determinations?
There is a formal process for doing a 5-year review determination, and as you mentioned, with the Hudson River, we did a draft and put it out for public comment. We did extensive interagency coordination on it, and now we're in that step with the final. It is the case that we are working hard on this, and I listened carefully to what you said, and I will naturally take that back, and we've had input as well from New York State, as well as natural resource trustees at the federal level, including. So we'll take that all back, but we have not yet resolved the 5-year review.
And you'll factor all of those concerns that the state has shared and others
Yes, sir.
into its final decision?
Yes, sir.
I do not believe the site possibly being protective 55 years from now is deserving of it being granted a current status of being complete and protective. I would encourage EPA to take another look at the evidence gathered by your counterparts in the New York State government and other federal agencies. One of the goals of the Superfund Task Force recommendations is to engage partners and stakeholders. So unfortunately, everything we have seen from this administration has been contrary to that given goal. There's been a shocking lack of transparency in both the development of the task force recommendations and the choice of 21 targeted sites. Given that lack of transparency, it is especially problematic that we do not have the agency's political leadership here today to testify. Mr. Breen, how were the members of the Superfund Task Force chosen?
For the most part, they are overwhelmingly career members of the EPA whose assignments, they're mostly senior, very senior members, whose assignments bring them into the kind of work that the task force has undertaken. There wasn't a formal sort of filter where only some people could be on. I was on some of the phone calls, and it seemed to be a considerable matter of people's work making them the natural choice to be on.
Okay, now for the next questions, I'd appreciate a yes or no answer. Administrator Pruitt noted that stakeholder partners contributed to the task force report. Did the task force comply with the requirements of the Federal Advisory Committee Act?
To the best of my knowledge, the answer is yes.
Were task force members announced in the Federal Register or at least on the agency's website?
I believe there is a list posted. I don't think it's on the agency's website, but I would have to check on that. But I want to be clear, this is an internal group, not an external Federal Advisory Committee.
Right, but again, were they listed in the register?
No, I don't believe so.
Did the task force hold public meetings?
No.
Did the task force publish proposed recommendations for public comment and other responses to public comments?
So I understand you want a yes and no. The task force report itself, which we published in July, is intending to be a living document, and we
Right.
would be grateful for input on it.
So did they publish proposed recommendations for public comment?
Not before July of 2017.
Okay. Did the task force maintain and publish records of its meetings and process?
So,
Yes or no on
again,
that
I
one?
understand, sir. The task force isn't a freestanding body. It's a group of people who work together.
All right,
and
but did they
had-
maintain and publish records of their meetings and process?
We have not published records.
Okay, this is disappointing and frankly counterproductive. Transparency can go a long way to building trust and community support for Superfund activities, which is essential for effective cleanups. Let's move on to the list of 21 targeted sites announced on December 8th. Again, yes or no answers, please. Did EPA develop a formalized methodology for selecting sites?
You're asking, did EPA acknowledge?
Did they develop a formalized methodology for selecting sites?
We have an objective for what we were looking for in the list of sites.
But no formalized methodology?
Well, I would say there was a methodology. We asked the regions for candidates. We understood what that objective was, which I can tell you. And then the regions came in with sites. There was discussion about it. And then finally, a list was given to the administrator.
Okay, let's move on. Did EPA hold public meetings or solicit public recommendations for sites to be included on the list?
So a number of times, I'd have to say, we asked people what should be included, but I don't think we held a public meeting
Okay.
specifically on that topic.
Okay, did EPA publish a proposed list for public comment?
No.
Did EPA confer with stakeholders at sites before they were listed, including the formal community advisory groups?
So we did not ask the regions to formally go out to the community advisory groups, but in asking the regions what sites to put on the list, regions may usefully have taken into account what they thought would be the public.
All right, has EPA met with stakeholders at the listed sites since they were listed to explain the consequences of listing?
I would have to check on that on a site-by-site basis and get back to you.
Okay, the chair has been very patient. The chair now will reclaim the time and yield to the gentleman from West Virginia, Mr. McKinley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Breen, for appearing here today. I was impressed with how quickly you were able to put together these recommendations, because apparently the charge was put in May, and by July, they had 42 recommendations. That's, given the work output in Washington, that's a dynamic thing to be able to accomplish 42 recommendations in 2 months to come up with it. And I was particularly impressed with one component of it. It was, I think, a recommendation 23 and 28 perhaps, had to do with comfort levels, comfort letters. Having come from the engineering practice and working on some of these Superfund sites and other brownfield locations, owners are desperately want to understand whether or not this site is clean. And I don't know whether people have been able to read yet the recommendations that you had, but one of the comfort levels that in the past is pretty illuminating, in that here it is at the conclusion of a typical comfort level. It says this is coming from the EPA. This letter is provided solely for informational purposes. They're trying to get, an owner is trying to find out, or a prospective buyer, is this site clean? And so the government gets back to them in a bureaucratic fashion by saying this letter is provided solely for informational purposes and is not otherwise intended to limit or affect the EPA's authority under CERCLA or provide a release from CERCLA liability. There's no comfort. So I'm curious now, how much progress you think have you made since July, when those report came out, that you might be able to have something on a comfort level that actually does give comfort and support for someone?
Thanks, Mr. McKinley. So we do intend to come out with a quarterly progress report starting soon that would have recommendation by recommendation our approach. What I'd like to do is offer a briefing for you and your staff on where we are on that particular recommendation in particular, without waiting for the quarterly report. We'll get back to you with some specifics.
Okay, if you could. The other is, I'm trying to understand the driving factor that puts these sites.
Yes.
Is it bankruptcies, can you, if a company declares bankruptcy, there seems to be unclear whether or not they can shed their liability in a bankruptcy. What causes a site to be transferred from a corporation or a business over to the federal government to clean it up? What would be an example?
So a site could be on the National Superfund priority list with a bankruptcy situation or without, either one. Bankruptcy would be an important marker that there are not enough assets in the corporation in order for the enforcement part of the Superfund program to seek cost recovery.
But couldn't we go back personally on the stockholders or some? Why has this become a way to shed responsibilities of corporations to the federal government?
So there are lawyers at the Justice Department who do this 12 hours a day. I would probably do best to get you one of the environmental bankruptcy lawyers at the Justice Department.
Yeah, I'd like to hear back from someone what would be some suggested legislation that we might be able to do to make sure they can't shed this, because we've had enough problems around here with corporations shedding their pension responsibilities, and I don't like the idea of them also shedding their environmental liabilities as well. So,
Thank you.
is there anything else that, there was another question. If it's taking 5 years to come up with a plan, why would that, what can we do from Congress to speed up this process that after we've identified it, why would it take 5 years to come up with a remedial process when EPA has demonstrated that within 2 months they can come up with 42 suggestions?
So we don't want it to take long either. We are. That's why we come to work every day, is to get it cleaned up. The truth is, we don't pick the worst sites. The worst sites get, what I mean to say is, we pick the worst sites. We didn't make them. So they're on our list precisely because they're hard and difficult. So sometimes to do it right does take time, but we want to go faster too.
Okay, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair now recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Obviously, I wanted to use my time today to ask Albert Kelly, the controversial political appointee who's been put in charge of the Superfund program, to explain to the American people exactly what he did to get barred for life from the banking industry. But unfortunately, he backed out, probably because he doesn't want to answer these questions. And like my colleague from New York, Mr. Tonko, I find this lack of transparency unacceptable, and I'm also concerned that my Republican colleagues on the committee continue to enable this lack of transparency because they don't insist on his being here or do other things to try to get him here. So I'm going to have to turn to Mr. Breen because he's the only witness. Mr. Breen, can you explain to the American people what exactly Mr. Kelly did to get barred for life from the banking industry?
I understand that Mr. Kelly elected to settle a matter with the FDIC. He suggested I pass on to you that he is fully willing to discuss this matter.
Well, I would hope then that, as I said before, Mr. Chairman, that we can get him back for another hearing, bring him in here to testify, because I think he's the only one that can really answer the question. But I appreciate the fact that he's willing to come back, and I would hope that that would mean that you would be willing to bring him back. Because, this really is a matter that relates, I think, to the long-term solvency of the Superfund program. Now, since 1983, EPA has relied on the National Priorities List to identify and target the Superfund sites that present the greatest threat to human health and the environment. In December, EPA introduced a new list of sites that would be targeted for immediate intense action. That list is not based on risk to human health or the environment, meaning that some of the most dangerous Superfund sites are not being targeted, and I quote, for immediate intense action. Then yesterday, EPA published yet another new list of sites, the sites that EPA believes have the greatest potential for redevelopment. This list is also not based on risk to human health or the environment. And suddenly, one list has become three, and I think the public is understandably confused. So, Mr. Breen, am I correct that neither of these new lists targets the sites that present the greatest risk to human health and the environment?
The answer is yes. I want to thank you, Mr. Pallone, for your personal support and interest over the years. We
Well, I
greatly
appreciate that. But I mean, isn't the mission of EPA and the Superfund program to protect human health and the environment? Isn't that the reason?
That's right. So the
Right.
national priorities list is risk-based. These are units within the NPL that we use to say these need the administrator's attention, and
Okay.
these others are available for redevelopment to bring money and jobs to the site even while we're addressing risk.
No, I understand that, but we've heard a great deal about how Administrator Pruitt is attempting to focus on the core mission of the agency. So to me, it's kind of alarming to see that these actions that, seem to focus the EPA attention away from the riskiest sites. Mr. Breen, is EPA still committed to cleaning up the sites that pose the greatest risk to human health and the environment?
Yes,
Okay. And even if those sites don't appear on either of these new lists, that's still true?
yes.
Okay. But again, it's kind of ridiculous that I have to ask you these questions, but EPA's recent actions, in my opinion, have called into question whether the agency is still focused on the most dangerous sites. I've heard from communities in my district that are threatened by these sites and the sites that weren't included on the new list, and they don't know what it means. So does EPA have plans to reach out to those communities to reassure them that their cleanups are still a priority, even though they're not on these new lists?
You've marked for us work we need to do. We are not moving away from cleaning up all the sites, and for that matter, the riskiest sites get a very high priority.
All right, so can you say right now, you seem to be saying, but I'm going to ask you more specifically, can you say right now to reassure these communities that their sites will still get funding, still get EPA attention, and still get health protective cleanups, that that's the goal?
Yes, sir. The one thing I have to worry about is funding, as do we
Okay.
all.
Well, again, when we talk about funding, myself and many Democrats on this committee have, introduced legislation to try to reinstitute the trust fund and reinstitute, the tax on the oil and chemical industry that would provide more funding so we don't have to rely on the general revenue. But we haven't been able to get the Republicans to do that. And I go back to, when Newt Gingrich was the speaker and it expired because he didn't want to do it. So again, I'm just concerned that many endangered communities are being ignored, even as Administrator Pruitt declares the Superfund to be his top priority. But thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair now recognizes gentleman from Texas, Mr. Olson, for 5 minutes.
I thank the chair and welcome Mr. Breen. As you know, Texas has more than its fair share of Superfund sites. One site that's causing the most concern in Texas 22, as we mentioned earlier, is the San Jacinto River waste pits. Waste from paper manufacturing has been stored in hardened caps at the bottom of San Jacinto River for about 40 years. Hurricane Harvey, bringing down 60 inches of rain in some places, overwhelmed those caps, and cancer-causing dioxin was released. One EPA estimate of the release, they measured 70,000 nanograms per kilogram. The cleanup threshold is 30 nanograms per kilogram. That's the same chemical and natural forces that started the Superfund in Love Canal. We'd like to thank you and Administrator Pruitt for committing to remove all of that waste, not just recap it, but remove it from threat. You also mentioned emergency response to your testimony. You said that you have to deal with 30,000 release notifications each year. Some of those are really important, some not as important. My question is, how do you determine when it's appropriate for you to step in an emergency, or when should you let that go to the states and locals to take care of some contamination?
Thank you. There's a very well-practiced protocol for that. The calls go to one central place, the National Response Center, which is operated by the U.S. Coast Guard. They get, as I said, about 30,000 calls a year. It's a 24-hour line. There are people on duty all the time. And as well, there are 10 EPA regional emergency operations centers and 1 EPA headquarters emergency operations center. As calls come in, the watch officer at the Coast Guard National Response Center is making some on-the-spot decisions about who to tell. And as I said, probably 99% of the time, it's the local fire department or the state hazmat unit, and that's as it should be. These are the people who are closest geographically anyway, and they know the communities the best. But frequently, they ask us to come in, and then we come in right along beside.
Thank you. Now, do you have the resources you need to address these calls, to do what you have to do by law?
So there's considerable work sharing between us and the states and local governments. And what's really happening very often is that professionals are deciding among themselves who's closest to the site, who can get there fastest, who's got the equipment and the people with advanced degrees to know what are the gases being released, what are the constituents going into the water.
So it sounds like you're okay, could probably use more, but you got what you need right now.
We will work with whatever you give us.
Well, thank you. I'd like to also talk about responsible parties and how we tackle some other sites like the San Jacinto River waste pits. In that case, we have 3 class action lawsuits out there right now with at least 3 defendants, none of whom were actually involved in the waste storage when it happened. And so we're trying to find out the responsible party. Can you talk about how we can determine who is the or a responsible party? And what is the process for getting them to the table earlier rather than later?
I can speak in general terms. Given the litigation, I probably ought to be careful not to speak in particular terms about this site and this set of potentially responsible parties. In general terms, Congress sets who is a potentially responsible party. Present owners and operators at the time of disposal, those who arranged for the hazardous substance to be put at the site, and those who transported it there. There's a PRP search typically early in a site's development, and while the engineers are doing site evaluation and remedial investigations, the enforcement program is seeing who could ultimately be brought to the table. There are notice letters, general and special notice letters that go out, but that's not the end of the story. We continue to look for potentially responsible parties. Ultimately, we'll pick those who we think both have responsibility and the assets to pursue.
Well, thank you. Those are my questions. I'd like to also congratulate you and Chairman Shimkus, because for the first time in 15 years, y'all have beaten my Navy, Army in football. So congratulations. 2 in a row. I yield back.
I think we're 2-0 right now. So, Chair, now recognize the gentleman from California, Dr. Reeser, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Since 1980, the Superfund program has cleaned up hazardous sites and helped corporations such as landfill operators, chemical companies, and manufacturers hold them accountable for polluting communities across the country. In May, Administrator Pruitt announced the creation of a Superfund task force that would prioritize and streamline procedures for remediating more than 1,300 sites. While it would be appropriate for this committee to hold public hearings on potential updates to the Superfund program and how to ensure necessary cleanups are not delayed, Administrator Pruitt's unilateral decision to streamline the process raises some serious transparency concerns. Which procedure specifically is the task force streamlining? Meaningful consultation with affected tribes are required by Executive Order 13175. The scientific evaluation and scoring of sites based on the severity of the contamination, the prioritization of the most contaminated sites for limited federal cleanup funds. The American public and this committee are all wondering which specific proposals Administrator Pruitt unilaterally decided to streamline, and I hope today's hearing will shed some light. Since I came to Congress, I've heard horror stories about the pollution and contamination of tribal lands or near tribal lands that tribes rely on that our government turned a blind eye toward for decades. 2 years ago, I convened a roundtable discussion to hear from tribal leaders across the nation and learn more about the environmental injustices they have dealt with and continue to face with federal agencies. One tribe in particular, the St. Regis Mohawk in New York, raised concerns with the EPA's effectiveness in mitigating the impacts of 2 Superfund sites located directly upstream and upwind from where the tribes draw its drinking water. Although consulted, the EPA disregarded the St. Regis Mohawk's input on the level of remediation required at each site. Later, testing revealed elevated levels of pollution in fish from nearby water sources that the tribe relies on for their economy and their consumption. living in close proximity to environmental hazards, yet not being meaningfully consulted in the government's mitigation planning, threatens the health and well-being of tribal members who rely on resources like rivers for survival. That's why I, along with Ranking Member Pallone, Ranking Member Grijalva, and 24 other members of Congress, asked the Government Accountability Office to prepare an investigative report on the adequacy of federal policies that protect tribal lands and recommendations for how the policies can be improved. GAO has since initiated the study, and I look forward to seeing the results and identifying how we can improve the way our government works with tribal governments, not walk away from our responsibility. Now is not the time to stop this momentum and push environmental injustices back into the shadows. The flagrant lack of transparency surrounding the task force selection of sites, coupled with a failure to hold any public meetings, confirms that the task force is a step perhaps in the wrong direction. We have a duty to ensure that the families living in these communities and disproportionately suffering from exposure to pollutants emanating from these Superfund sites are being meaningfully engaged in the remediation process, so that they can enjoy a cleaner, safer outdoor environment to work, play, and raise their families. Mr. Breen, since the last task force failed to generate a record of its deliberations, I'm troubled by the lack of transparency on whether affected communities were meaningfully consulted. So what specific procedures did the task force follow to meaningfully consult with affected tribes and communities living near toxic sites during the selection process of the 21 sites recommended for immediate intense action?
Thank you very much. And we completely agree that our relations with tribal governments are of high importance. This is a government-to-government relationship, and in many cases there are...
I've heard that for so many years, but the actions speak louder than words, and the actions do not show that. So what have you actually done to consult with tribes?
I will address that. I just didn't want to let it go unsaid.
I only have 47 seconds left, and it seems like you're stalling. So what actions
I'm definitely not stalling.
have you done to meaningfully implement meaningful consultation with tribes?
Of the 21 sites that we identified for the administrator's immediate and intense attention, in our data system, 8 of the 21 are identified as having Native American interest.
That's not meaningful consultation. That's what I've heard over and over again, where they have Native American interest, or they invite a Native American to a room just to check a box. That is not meaningful consultation where you take their considerations, their concerns, and actually implement with them at the table. This is exactly what went wrong with the St. Regis Mohawk problem with the contamination of the rivers. They went to a meeting, they checked the box, they weren't listened to, nothing was implemented, and now they have a problem. I yield back my time.
I thank the gentleman, and gentleman yields back his time. The chair and I recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Carter, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Breen, thank you for being here. Appreciate your indulgence with us. I'm over here. Hello?
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'm looking at...
Okay, thank you.
I was getting
Appreciate
out
it.
my right sheet of paper.
That's okay. That's okay. Mr. Breen, I was just wondering, in 1996, you remember what you were doing? I mean, were you with the agency then, or?
I was.
You were?
Yeah.
Okay. That's a long time ago, right? 1996? Yeah. In 1996, the LCP chemical site in Brunswick, Georgia, was put on the national priorities list in 1996. 20 years later, in 2016, a settlement was announced, but we still don't have funding. The funding still hasn't materialized. Seriously? I mean, seriously? Why? What? Dumb it down for me. Tell me what's going on here. I mean, seriously.
So I have, the reason I was looking for my sheet of paper was to get some facts, but on the question of why not funding, I don't have that, and I will commit to getting you that.
We got a settlement in 2016, and we don't expect funding for years to come. And this is something that happened in 1996.
Right. I will commit to getting you more information on that.
But, okay, and I appreciate that. I sincerely do. Why did it take so long?
I'm going to have to just get you more on the site in general for that as well. I can tell you some things, but I can't tell you that.
Let me ask you, just in general, why do these claims take so long? I mean, when the EPA is the EPA doing the work, or is the DOJ doing the work? Who's responsible here?
So I can help with that. So the remedy selection and the remedy design and the construction is an EPA responsibility. Often we're doing it with the state, but it is an EPA responsibility. Pursuing the potentially responsible parties is a Justice Department lead in courtroom matters, always with an EPA strong participation.
So the EPA does have a say in these settlements.
Yeah.
In these type of settlements, they have a say, and they're divided up, and they provide direction on funds outside of the direct remediation. EPA has that authority and has that ability.
Yes.
So is the EPA able to usher these claims along?
Which claims?
These claims, such as this, with the one that I'm stating here with the LCP chemical site in Brunswick?
Sure. So where there's a potentially responsible party, EPA would be doing the site investigation that would lead to the referral to the Justice Department.
Okay. Earlier, you talked about the 42 recommendations that were outlined in the Superfund Task Force report. And one aspect of these sites is that it's taken so long to remediate. The administration's top 10 list, has it materialized, and has that been set yet?
Thank you. When we did the task force report, we envisioned a top 10 list. It turns out that we thought there was more progress we could make than just at 10 sites. So what we thought was going to be 10 turned out to be 21, and that's the list that we produced last month.
So what started out as 10 turned out to be 21.
Yes.
Right. You mentioned about state involvement and about task force report. And in the task force report, it describes the importance of third-party investments. Can you elaborate on that just a little?
Sure. So there are sites that are in productive reuse, hundreds of sites that are in productive reuse, and often that's taking the work from mere clean to actually usable. And the use of private investment for that is a strong possibility.
Do you see any alternative methods or approaches to financing site cleanups?
I think there probably are things we could be thinking about.
Any examples?
Sure. I think the Brownfields program gives us some examples we could look toward and understand better and learn from.
Okay. Mr. Breen, I'm not trying to give you a hard time, but I'm the one who has to go back to my district and answer these people, and they want to know, 20 years? Seriously? And yet we got a settlement where we still haven't had any financial relief whatsoever. I mean, what am I supposed to tell them?
Well, we'd like to sit down with you and walk you through it so you have that information.
Okay. All right. I hope it'll be within the next 20 years. I mean, seriously.
If the gentleman would yield, I know he's about ready to finish time, but if and when you have that meeting, I'd like to attend. I think it's a budgetary issue. I think it's a funding issue, and I think there's a deeper question to this answer.
Great. Well, thank you very much, and I
Gentleman's
yield.
time's expired. Chair, and I recognize gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. In holding today's hearing, a strong and well-funded Superfund program is necessary to ensure the toxic sites in Texas and throughout the United States are cleaned up. Mr. Breen, thank you for joining us today at our hearing. I have a district in Houston, Texas, and in Texas was hard hit by Hurricane Harvey in August, and it destroyed houses, schools, businesses along the Texas Gulf Coast. A major concern from our community during that after Harvey was the status of the nearly 24 Superfund sites in and around the Houston area. The major one was the San Jacinto River waste pits, and I want to thank EPA and the administrator for being there right after the water subsided and visiting that site and also making a decision that they will be cleaned up. Of course, we have a responsible party with that facility. One of the things I kept hearing, because we did have a fire that's just to the east of my area, is there a national toll-free number that people call at the EPA with a tragedy or something like that to get information? Or
Well, there is a national number for calling and reporting a release. In terms of getting information, I think probably hope those calls get routed to the people in the regions who
Yeah.
are closest to it, rather than handling them back.
Well, in our Region 6, like I said on this one, but because of where we're located in our industries, we have a significant number of Superfund sites. Is there a team that's ready to be deployed at sites immediately after a national disaster?
Yes, we have about 200 to 250 on-scene coordinators. These are men and women who, as they say, sleep with their boots by their beds. And there is at all times someone who is on call, ready to go.
Okay, because we did have some tragedies at some of our facilities after that. One of the hallmarks of the Superfund is a polluter pays principle, which holds polluters liable for the cleanup of toxic substance. Last month, Administrator Pruitt came before our committee, and I asked Administrator Pruitt about the orphan Superfund sites that do not have identified responsible parties or are PRP. I'd like to follow up on the questions. How many orphan sites are listed on the national priorities list? Do you have a number?
And I wondered about that too when your staff mentioned you would ask. I don't have a specific number. I can tell you we usually approximate that at the remedial actions, the responsible parties are performing the work about 60 to 70% of the time. But even at the remaining 30 to 40%, it's often the case that there are people we can go after, but we don't want to wait to make them do it. So we're doing it ourselves, and we'll get reimbursed. So I don't know how many orphan sites there are.
I hope that reimbursement works.
Yeah, we hope so too. But it usually does. And we'll commit to getting you as best a number as we can.
Okay, and so my second question was, does the taxpayer pay for the cleanup? In those cases, on an orphan, the taxpayer may clean, but you're still going after somebody who may be the responsible party.
That's right. If it's a truly orphan site, then there's nothing else but the federal government. But even at sites where there are PRPs not doing the work, we'll seek cost recovery if we think we can get the money.
The appropriations process, the money for the Superfund Trust Fund, did EPA request a funding increase for the Superfund for this current year? Do you know of?
I think the president's budget does not.
Okay. Was there a proposed cut in the Superfund? I haven't looked at the president's budget. We're not on appropriations, so we don't carry it around with us.
I think the president's budget showed a reflection of less money, but as I said, we'll work with whatever you give us.
In the Obama administration, 61 sites for Superfund sites were removed from the NPL, including 12 toxic sites in 2014 alone. Can the administrator set an expectation for accelerating work and progress on all these Superfund nationwide when EPA is recommending the sharpest budget cuts in the nation's history, or the agency's history, and eliminating at 4,000 positions? Of course, the president's budget, and we know we appropriate the money. Someday we'll have an appropriations bill maybe, but I hope that EPA has seriously re-examined its budget request for 2019 that will fully protect what in our area is human life and environment in a very urban area, but also a very industrialized area in the upper Texas coast. I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the time.
Gentleman's time's expired. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Tonka for holding this hearing. Mr. Breen, we appreciate you being here. I've looked at your just limited bio that we're presented, and it's unbelievably positively impressive. Princeton, Harvard Law, active Army, Justice Department, Criminal Division, and that's all before you went to EPA. I mean, that's impressive. It really is. How long have you actually been at the EPA?
About 25 years.
25 years. So that would be 93?
It was toward the end of 1992.
1992.
Yeah.
Okay, so 1992, let's see, first Bush was president.
Right.
Did you go into the EPA as a civil service or as a political?
Civil service.
Civil service. So your career has been in the civil service.
Yeah.
Do you have at present at EPA a political appointee above you? other than Administrator Pruitt?
No.
No. Is there been someone who has been sent to the Senate?
No.
No. Is there anybody under consideration?
That
You don't know.
I'd have to defer on.
So for the time being, you're the man. Is that fair to say?
I'm the national program manager
That's-
for the Superfund program.
In Texas, we'd say you're the man, yeah. Just out of curiosity, does the name Jan Giroux strike a bell with you?
It does, but
She's my sister. She is a environmental enforcement attorney for Region 6 EPA in Dallas
congratulations.
and is reputed to be a holy terror.
I will take that back.
I don't normally admit to that up here in Washington, since I'm a conservative Republican, but she goes at them. She goes and gets them.
Thank you.
Has almost 100% conviction rate. At least that's what she tells me. What of the our Congressman Carter from Georgia was just rightfully so complaining about a Superfund site in his district that apparently nothing's been done on in 22 years. Can you tell me how many Superfund sites have actually been cleaned up in the history of the program?
Yes. And I ought to get you the exact number. Cleanup is a term that really occurs in stages. So we have deleted hundreds from the national priorities list. But even before a site is deleted, it can be ready for anticipated use. And we have hundreds more ready for anticipated use. And even sometimes cleanup is, when is the construction complete, even if the public isn't ready to use it yet. And we have even more yet. So I will get you specific
So
numbers
just
on
kind
all
of
of
a
the
ballpark number, 700 or 800?
For construction completion, I think we're higher than that.
Okay. Now, the staff briefing says that there are 1,341 sites that are still listed.
Right.
Do you agree with that number?
It's, the question is whether it includes the list we just put out a few weeks ago. So I could,
But for
we had a
debating purposes, that's a
give or
good
take.
number.
Yeah.
What's a reasonable number for Congress to expect of the existing sites to be cleaned up per year?
How many?
Yeah, 10 per year, 12 per year?
So we will make projections in our budget forecast that we'll give you in a week and a half for what we would project to do. I would probably be best to wait to get you those numbers.
Okay, but I mean, is it reasonable for the Congress to expect double-digit sites per year to be cleaned up?
Yes, for construction completions, I think so. How many double digits, whether it's 10 or 30 or whatever,
Now,
I ought to wait.
And our chairman alluded to this, is the primary reason we don't have more progress on sites like Congressman Carter's because we just don't have the funding? Is that the primary reason, or is it the complexity and the technical issues involved with the actual cleanup?
It's a mix. We think there are things we can do and that we're undertaking to be more efficient, and we're going to push hard on those. In the end, though, there may be sites that still we can't get to, and that's been the case for years. For probably every year but one out of the last, say, 10 or 15, there are sites we haven't gotten to.
Okay, well, my time's expired, but we do appreciate your service, and I think we've got a bipartisan agreement on the subcommittee that we need to modernize the Superfund process, but we also need to fund it. If it's a funding issue, we need to clean these sites up. I mean, Congressman Carter's got a very legitimate issue when this site's been on the list for 22 years, and it doesn't appear that anything's been done. Now,
Gentleman's time's expired.
all right, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes our own holy terror from the state of Colorado, Ms. Taguette, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much for that vote of confidence, Mr. Chairman.
Holy terror is a compliment.
From you, probably. So Mr. Breeden, Congressman Carter, in your conversation with him, you talked about the potential of using brownfields money for remediation. But of course, we're we're prohibited from using brownfields money, yes or no?
I didn't mean to
Okay,
suggest
yeah,
brownfields
yes, we're
money.
prohibited from using brownfields money for Superfund cleanup,
Yes.
right? And in fact, the whole idea of brownfields is very different from Superfund, right?
Not
I mean, you wouldn't want
necessarily.
it, you wouldn't want to take all the brownfields money and use that for Superfund.
We wouldn't want to do that.
Thank you. Now, I want to ask you a couple of other questions. You told Mr. Tonko that there's a list of the members of the task force, is that
Yes.
right? Can we get a copy of that list?
Yes.
Thank you so much. Now, do we have records of when the task force met?
What we have are 100 people's meeting notes that they took from the meetings they
But
went
do we
to.
have actual records of when the meetings were?
I'd have to check.
If you have them, can we get a copy of that too? And were there minutes of what was requested at those meetings?
Not to my knowledge,
Just the notes of the members?
of individuals.
Okay. Now, in your experience, is it a normal practice at the EPA for a task force to develop a report with no written records?
It's not the case that we have no written records.
Well, okay, let me ask you this then. Is it the practice for a task force to meet and to have no minutes or other records of what was discussed?
Minutes would be pretty unusual. Other records is kind of the same situation.
Do we
as
have
here.
other records of the task force?
Sure.
Okay, can we get a copy of those?
I'll have to turn that over to the people who actually manage the.
But you don't have an objection?
I don't personally have them.
Okay. I just have to say, Mr. Chairman, it seems a little odd to me that you'd have a task force with a recommendation, but no minutes, no nothing. So I'll be eager to see what I can get, Mr. Breen. I want to talk to you for the time I have remaining about the Gold King mine. I imagine you'd assume that. The Gold King mine in Colorado, it was included on the EPA list released on December 8, targeted for immediate intense action. A lot of us from Colorado have been focused on addressing the environmental damage caused by the August 2015 release of toxic mine water that tainted the Animas River and caused hardship for Coloradoans, New Mexicans, and members of the Navajo tribe living downstream. So I want to ask you a couple questions. First of all, I understand that the EPA is currently conducting a remedial investigation and feasibility study. Can you give us a timeline for when that study will be released?
It is the case we are undertaking a remedial investigation. I don't have a target date for conclusion of it. I will get that to you.
That would be great, thanks. Now, one of the goals highlighted by the Superfund Task Force was, quote, engaging partners and stakeholders. What actions is the EPA taking to engage stakeholders while the remediation plan is being developed?
Thank you. So first of all, we are have provided more than $2 million to states and tribes to support water quality monitoring while the
Right.
work is going on.
Well, that's great, but what are you doing to engage the stakeholders? Are you having meetings, or what efforts are you undertaking?
There are community involvement coordinators who are working on the Bonita, what we call the Bonita Peak Mining District, because it's the
Right.
Gold King Mine and several
As
dozen
part of that,
more.
yeah.
Let me ask them to summarize for you what they're doing and get that to you.
That would be excellent, thank you, because I know people are concerned. Also, in terms of funding, the EPA spent about $29 million responding to the release, and about $5 million in additional cleanup at the site. Is that correct?
The number $29 million is in my notes. I didn't have the other five.
The $5 million was after that.
Okay.
So my question to you is the EPA committed to providing sufficient funding to complete the cleanup that we need to do?
Yes.
Okay, great. Finally, I understand the EPA is opening a water treatment plan to clean up the water from Gold King Mine at the cost of $1.2 million. What is the EPA's long-term plan for the plant's operating costs?
Well, if we're talking about the same thing, we know that in 2018, we'll continue to treat all the water from
Right.
the Gold King Mine. Beyond 2018, I don't have written down.
You
I'll have to
don't
get
know
that for
who's
you.
going to be in charge of that after?
Oh, I know who will be in charge. I just don't have it to tell you at the
Okay.
minute.
Great. If you can
But we'll get that
let
for
me
you.
know, I'd appreciate it. Thank you so much. Thanks for your years of service to the agency, too.
Thank you.
Gentley's time's expired. Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Johnson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Breen, thank you for joining us today. How can the EPA use incentives to encourage responsible parties to cooperate and come to the table early in order to avoid the increased transaction costs associated with protracted negotiation?
Yes, the statute gives us considerable tools, and I can explain a few of them and tell you we're eager to find whatever more tools, and that's one of the recommendations, is to look at this.
Okay.
This is probably the most powerful statute as in terms of civil liability that the Congress has written for environmental law. If we give an order and the responsible party does not comply, in addition to daily penalties of $25,000 or more per day, when we ultimately clean up the site ourselves, we can sue for punitive treble damages. So if we clean up for $5 million, the defendant is exposed to our $5 million of cost recovery, $15 million in punitive damages, and $25,000 or more per day. It's an enormous exposure on the defendant's part, not one that companies take on lightly.
Okay, well, that actually answers my second question. How can you use enforcement authorities? And that's some of the enforcement leverage that the EPA has to get a cleanup started or to help reach settlement, right?
Right.
Okay. How does the EPA ensure the timeliness and the cost effectiveness, consistency, and quality of cleanups?
We have a number of methods in place. First of all, the remedial project managers are well-trained, and they all have branch chiefs who are experienced and veterans. And so the natural thing is to design remedies by people who are well-trained and expert. For most remedies above a certain amount, we then take it into what's basically an internal peer review process. For about the last 20 to 25 years, we've used what's called a remedy review board. And remedies over a certain size get discussed by all 10 regions before the remedy selection is finalized. And now for the largest remedies, we take them to the administrator himself. And that in that way, the whole region, including the regional administrator, we take them to the U.S. EPA administrator. So the regional administrator will be involved as well as headquarters.
Okay, all right. Finding new ways to efficiently address and clean up sites on the national priority list is certainly commendable. And we've talked a lot about that here today. That's why I'm encouraged by EPA's focus on this issue through the Superfund Task Force and its recommendations. So while the Superfund Task Force notes that there is no need for statutory changes to carry out its recommendations, were there ideas omitted that did require congressional action, and are there any recommendations that could be most effective through a statutory change?
So in the deliberations of the task force, we just put aside anything that might lead to a need for statutory change. It just wasn't within the scope. I did observe that in last month's hearing, the administrator, when one of your colleagues asked that question, the administrator said that perhaps there are lessons to be learned from the new brownfields legislation that could be carried into Superfund. We'd be prepared to discuss those kinds of ideas or others with you.
Okay, all right, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back a whole minute and 13 seconds.
Chair, thanks, and you gentleman yields back his time. Now we recognize gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney, for 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Breen, for appearing this morning. When Administrator Pruitt was here last month, I brought up the importance of enforcing all of our environmental laws, not just relating to Superfund. If we fail to enforce all of our environmental laws, we will continue to create new dangerous sites, adding to the National Superfund priorities list. Unfortunately, I think this administration's efforts to delay and dismantle regulations will do just that. Mr. Breen, as Deputy Administrator for the Office of Land and Emergency Management, I would like to ask you about some of the rules that have been delayed or repealed. The Risk Management Planning Program amendments would have made chemical facilities with large stores of dangerous chemicals safer. Those amendments were about to take effect last year but have been repeatedly delayed and now being reconsidered. If a disaster were to strike a facility covered by the Risk Management Planning Program, leading to a large-scale release of toxic chemicals, Could that release lead to the creation of new Superfund sites?
Thank you. So the risk management program, the public comment period in 2016 ended within a couple of days, a few days, of an important ATF finding that the West Texas explosion, which had motivated so many of us to do better, that the West Texas explosion was associated with arson rather than an accident. That important fact needed to be taken into account. So we delayed the effective date in order to take that and similar kinds of input into account. But to answer your question, any site could explode and create a Superfund site.
Well, turning now to the requirements for safe disposal rule of waste under the Resource Conservation and Recovery Rule, we all know that unsafe disposal of waste can lead to the creation of Superfund sites. Despite this, the EPA announced in September that the agency would reconsider the final rule governing the disposal of coal ash. When the Knightston coal ash impound burst in 2009, the contaminated water that was released created a new Superfund site. Is that right?
I don't know if it created a new Superfund site, but it certainly released material that we responded to.
Thank you. Your office also handles emergency response, including response to hurricanes.
Yes.
And as we've seen this year, and also illustrated by my friend Mr. Olson, hurricanes can damage Superfund sites and cause dangerous release from refineries and chemical plants. In my state of California, we've seen devastating wildfires and mudslides, which also have the potential to spread environmental contamination. Do you agree that extreme weather events have the potential to create or worsen Superfund sites?
Yes.
Hasn't the EPA found that Superfund sites are vulnerable to the effect of climate change, including flooding, rising sea levels, increasing wildfires, and changes in temperature?
So we took a study on this ourselves and found that, first of all, we have to respond to climate change, and that's just part of our mission set. And so we need to design remedies that account for that. And we don't get to pick where Superfund sites are. We deal with the waste where it is. So we found in our own study that our procedures were, for the most part, satisfactory, but that we needed to be careful and attentive and have some additional tools to meet those procedures. But as well, I think there are external reviews, both by the Government Accountability Office and the Inspector General, and we'll look forward to working with them to understand whether they think we need to be doing different, not just better.
Well, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I have here a June 2014 Climate Change Adaptation Implementation Plan adopted by Mr. Breen's office to address the risks of climate change to Superfund sites. Unfortunately, this document does not appear on the EPA's website, so I'd like to include it for the record.
Sir, hearing no objections to order.
All right.
And I thank you.
Despite this evidence, that climate change will make Superfund sites more dangerous and potentially create new additional Superfund sites, the Trump administration and the Pruitt EPA are undermining and rolling back our efforts to fight climate change. If the President and Administrator Pruitt are serious about addressing contaminated sites in our country, they need to abandon the regulatory rollbacks and strongly enforce all of our environmental laws, including the Clean Air Act, to address climate change. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman's time expired, Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Wahlberg, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Breen, for being here. One of the questions that always comes up about special accounts, and I'd like to ask if you could give us a brief overview of how special account funds are collected. If you would tell us what the current balance of the special accounts is, and if you could walk us through how special account funds are spent.
Yes, sir. So the current balance is about $3.2 billion in special accounts. And over all the years, we've collected about $6.8 billion. So $6.8 billion collected, 3.2 approximately on hand. In nearly every case, special accounts are funded as a result of a consent decree with a responsible party. and they give us cash. We can settle for cash or work or both, and there are plenty of times they give us cash. The United States has the authority under legislation that the Congress gave us to not turn that money over to the miscellaneous receipts account, which is where it would otherwise go, but to instead keep it in the EPA accounts at the Treasury in order to spend it at the site. So this is thanks to you that we do this.
So that's why the balance is so high at this point right now?
I'll just add one more thing.
Okay.
We earn interest on it, and the Treasury credits us interest. So we not just get the money from the PRPs, but we get money from the Treasury as interest grows. For many of these sites, it's smart to take the money now because we don't know if we said to the PRP, give us $1 million a year for the next 30 years, we are betting on that PRP having that money for the next 30 years. And it's just smarter to take it now and put it in the Treasury where it's safe and then spend it as it's needed. So for the $3.2 billion that's on hand, we have multi-year plans for every site with a material amount of money for how that money will be used year by year into the future.
Would the gentleman yield just on that for 1 second?
I certainly would.
Just so why we're asking this question is really following up on what Buddy Carter had said on his site. And it would be interesting in the discussions if some of his, the litigation or whatever went into that special account. And if so, why isn't that money being then used? That's kind of how we're following
Thank
up
you.
this line of question.
We will factor that in then. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wahlberg.
One of the recommendations of the task force is to use special account funds as financial incentives to potentially responsible parties to perform cleanup work. Can you explain how these incentives would work?
And there are important discussions to be had with the Justice Department on this and the Office of General Counsel. Obviously, we can only do what's statutorily authorized, and most of these accounts are created because we have a consent decree, which the Justice Department has been instrumental in providing. But it may be that within the terms of the consent decree, the money doesn't have to be used only in the way it was originally visioned, but it can be used in the way that's needed now. So we would be open to thinking about that and seeing what can be done.
So you could give incentives. Could you reimburse a potentially responsible party that completes the work early at the site?
That I would need to get counsel on to give a good answer for.
Okay. Does the statute need to be updated to clarify what special account funds may be used for?
We'd like to work with you on that. We'd want to make sure we sort of articulated for you what the need is. So let us work with you on that.
Okay. Well, thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time, and Chair thanks my colleague for that round of questions. Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Michigan, Ms. Dingo, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you and Ranking Member Tonko for having this hearing. And Mr. Breen, I do believe that you deeply care about this program, but I'm still have a lot of concerns, which I think you've been hearing all of my colleagues, Republican and Democrat, express today. The EPA Superfund program is really one of our cornerstone environmental pieces of legislation that has always shared great bipartisan support. Today, as you look at the future of the program, you can tell that all of us here are really worried about it, and we're really worried about what's not happening. And I hope that we're all going to work together in Congress to provide and protect full, robust funding during the annual appropriation process. Without strong and continued funding, we continue to increase the risk to our public health and the environment long term. We would also see negative economic consequences in communities plagued by contaminated pollution sites. Of the 1,345 sites on the national priority list, Michigan has 88 listed Superfund sites. And in my district alone, we've got 3 contaminated sites that need serious attention. Only one of them's been designated as an official. It's been put on this national priority list. And I guess I'm going to go off script, which I always do, and make this point that I've been in the Congress for 3 years. Walked into, in my first year, a meeting that the city people had asked me to organize for brownfield sites and was told by my region that this was on the list for the national priority site. It was already, it was a serious site. It's the Trenton McLeod Steel site, as you know. And by the way, my colleague, Mr. Wahlberg, abuts and shares with me the Gelman Science Dioxin plume in Ann Arbor as well, which we've been doing many meetings, and you know that you too have shared concerns on that. But I think, unfortunately, I've been in too many meetings on both of these sites, and what stuns me is that the site is leaking, that we're not telling the community there could be danger, and this Superfund site, or potential Superfund site that you've told me is going to be listed at some point on the national priority site, there was raw sugar being stored that was then being distributed in Michigan. So I think all of us are concerned that there are many more sites that are even on the site that need to be cleaned up, and it's taking too long to be designated. And then I've even been told on both sites, but even when you get designated, it's going to take years to get the money to clean it up. Now, we founded this law to keep communities clean. So I think all of you, you heard my colleague, Mr. Carter, talk about how long that site had been sitting there. This is a crisis in our country, that we've got sites that are hurting areas that aren't being cleaned up. So with my remaining time, I think funding for EPA's Superfund program matters, so it's going to be the focus of what's left. Appropriations to the Superfund program have generally declined between fiscal year 1999 and 2016 by about 45%. Additionally, cuts were announced for fiscal year 2018. Mr. Breen, in EPA's budget for fiscal year 2018, the Superfund program was decreased by 30%. Yes or no?
That's approximately right, certainly.
Concerning, this long decline in funding has delayed the start of the new remedial action projects in many states that I was just talking about. And additional cuts will only delay further projects. And yet, despite declining funds and a slowdown of completed remedial actions, Superfund sites continue to be added to the national priority list, which, by the way, I think they should be. Mr. Breen, why were dramatic cuts made to the Superfund program in the fiscal year 2018 budget? How do you justify these cuts as the national priority list grows? And can we expect future cuts to the program? And what the hell does that mean?
Thank you. First of all, of course, we always support the president's budget. Secondly, it's always true that we will work with what you give us. Let me now turn to what we can do within that. First, we are looking for ways to save money no matter what. Even if you are going to give us more money, we should be looking for ways to save money. The Inspector General told us a few months ago that they thought we could reallocate where Superfund personnel are assigned and be more efficient. The Inspector General told us that some regions are having to hold up work because of insufficient people to do it, and other regions are not. So we're going to undertake a way to, in a multi-year plan, look at how we distribute FTE among regions. We are looking at ways to do contracting better with a remedial action framework. And frankly, we think the 42 recommendations, some of those will yield savings.
Mr. Breen, can I ask you, because we're now in the positive, do you need more money to do what you need to do?
So there are choices we even make.
But that's not my point. Do we have sites that need to be cleaned up that are threatening people that need dollars to clean them up?
So I can answer that in this way. In almost every year for the last 10 or 15, at the end of the year, we have had sites that are ready to be funded, but that we didn't have funds to get to. These are projects that we didn't fund. That's been true for a very long time.
The gentleman's question has been answered, and she yields back her time. And the chair thanks Mr. Breen for his attendance. And I think it was an excellent job in answering the questions as we put forward you based upon your place where you're at. Are you ready to ask questions, Mr. Cardenas? So you're not excused. We still have one last member. The gentleman from California is recognized for 5 minutes.
Here we are. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Sorry about that. You're almost excused. But thank you for holding this important hearing. Let me gather my thoughts really quick. Okay. When it comes to environmental cleanups, and it comes to the status of where we're at in this country today, are we up to par? Are we all in order, or do we have much work to do?
We have first of all, we have a remarkable legacy that I couldn't be prouder of. We also have a lot more to do.
Okay. Is it specifically confined to one region or one state where we have more work to do?
We have nationwide considerable amount of work to do.
But I would venture to believe that there's probably not a state in the nation that doesn't have some effort that we need to address.
I would have to check on whether it's every state. I would need to get back to you on that.
Probably likely that, again, not every corner of the country, but there's probably no state that exempt from work that still needs to be done.
We have unfinished work in lots of places.
When it comes to the amount of funding that we have afforded ourselves to address these issues, are we where we need to be, or should we figure out a way to make sure that we responsibly try to help our local governments and our local communities address these issues?
We are looking for ways to be more efficient with the dollars that we get.
Always.
And in fact, one of the things the Superfund program does is fund on-the-ground emergency response. And there's a choice to be made about how much to put into emergency response and how much to save for the long-term cleanups. It's kind of a pick-your-favorite-child situation. You want to do more of both, but that's a judgment call.
Is potable water, I mean, we're a very blessed nation. We have a pretty high standard of living, et cetera, but is potable water still an issue in parts of our country? And also, is potable water being affected by activities that, unfortunately, we've affected that potable water in communities around the country?
Indeed, in your district, as you certainly know so well, better than me, we've produced 95 billion gallons of clean drinking water thanks to the work of the Superfund sites in your district.
And those Superfund sites are still going on literally today.
Exactly.
As my neighbors and even my children said, "Dad, thinking I know everything, what's that?" They cordon off a portion of a street, and I said, "Well, they're cleaning up the groundwater below us, et cetera." With issues as dangerous as chromium-6, and again, that your average American says, chromium what? But the bottom line is it's dangerous elements, heavy metals, et cetera, that we unfortunately allowed to leach into our drinking water. So that being the case, Los Angeles has been fortunate that I believe that with the cooperation of the state and support and the federal government, and with the largest Department of Water and Power that serves my community of the 4 million people of Los Angeles, we've been able to do a little bit of catch up, but we still have much work to do.
Yes.
Let's take a community like Los Angeles. People think it's a big city, but it is spread out. We have many aquifers, we have many sources of water, et cetera. Can you give me an example of what we could do more together with local government and the federal government when it comes to the cleanup that still has to be done in a community like Los Angeles?
Yes. One thing that we are doing right now is seeing whether we can make upgrades to the Superfund remedies presently installed in the sites in your district, rather than just say that we're going to let them run themselves down. We want to see if we can upgrade them, and that work is ongoing.
Okay. Again, to the earlier point that you and I agreed, much work to do.
Absolutely.
Now, that being the case, what can Americans do today to help make sure that we reduce the number of future Superfund sites, et cetera? And I'm not picking on business. I'm just saying, as a populace, whether it's business or individuals or government, what could we do to be more preventative?
This is a complicated question, and some of it is not law. Some of it is the ways in which we make things. One of the programs in my office at the EPA is sustainable materials management. It's a use of things that don't have to be thrown away, that can be reused or repurposed, and there's a lot of progress that could be made there.
And unfortunately, sometimes regulation is labeled as bad. But when it comes to, for example, potable water, it's so precious and to every community. Isn't it important that we have right-sized regulation and responsible, efficient regulation?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. All time expired, and we want to thank Mr. Breen again. We're going to talk real quick so you can get out of here before someone else shows up. Thank you very much, and we would like to sit the second panel, and we will dismiss Mr. Breen. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for listening to the first panel. I think that was could be helpful, and as we have our discussion here today, because we want to, the whole intent is to try to see if there's legislative changes we can do to make the system work better. So we want to thank you for being here today and taking the time to testify. At the second panel, we have Mr. Steve Cobb, Chief Land Division, Alabama Department of Environmental Management, on behalf of the Association of State Territorial Solid Waste Management Officials. We have John Winston Porter, Environment and Energy Consultant. We have James McKenna, Portland Harbor Policy Analyst from Governor Brown's Natural Resource Office. Debbie Mann is Executive Director and Baykeeper, New York, New Jersey Baykeeper, and Catherine Prost, who is an independent consultant. Your full records have been submitted for the record. You'll have 5 minutes. And with that, I'd like to turn to Mr. Cobb to start. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you for the introduction, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Chairman Shimkus, Ranking Member Tonko, members of the subcommittee. I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak at today's hearing. Representing SWAMO, which is the state and territorial solid waste management officials and the waste management officials, including those responsible for the oversight of cleanups, we appreciate the opportunity to present our thoughts on the topic of modernizing the Superfund cleanup program. As you're aware, much has changed and many lessons have been learned in the almost 40 years since CERCLA has been enacted. For example, robust cleanup programs have been developed by the states and EPA, and methods and technologies have been expanded. States have become key co-regulators and program partners with EPA in protecting human health and the environment. Given the history and growth of our cleanup programs, both state and federal, I'll describe several recommendations to consider in evaluating the modernization of the cleanup program. CERCLA is a vitally important tool in the EPA and state toolboxes for ensuring and implementing needed cleanup at many sites across the country. However, effective tools must be periodically sharpened and maintained to ensure their continued relevance and effectiveness. As a part of any effort to modernize the program, the National Contingency Plan should be updated to reflect important lessons learned from the almost 40 years of cleanup experience by states and EPA. In order to truly effect streamlining and efficiency improvements for the long term, changes to the program must be incorporated into the fabric of the program and communicated to those individuals who conduct the day-to-day implementation. The NCP is the rule book that project managers, supervisors, and legal support refer to on a regular basis for guidance and direction in managing cleanup and decision-making, and the foundation that CERCLA cleanup program guidance is based upon. The NCP should also be updated to provide for a more streamlined and efficient process for managing responsible party-led and funded cleanups as compared to those cleanups conducted directly by EPA using funds from the Superfund Trust Fund, where additional documentation is often required in order to support future litigation and cost recovery efforts. By providing for a more streamlined process for sites where the responsible party is funding and implementing the process, a further incentive is created to encourage responsible parties to step forward and work with the EPA and the states cooperatively to clean up sites in a more timely, efficient, and cost-effective manner. The process for identifying and selecting ARARs is also an area which should be addressed as part of modernizing the program. In addition, the statute and regulations should be updated to make clear that state environmental covenant, laws, and regulations are essential components of many remedial actions, especially those that require longer-lasting remediation activities. As a part of improving the ARR's identification and selection process, and in recognition of the co-regulator role of the states, it's important that the role for state co-regulators in CERCLA decision-making is enhanced. As a part of the evaluation of the ARR's process, perhaps also the long-standing CERCLA exemption from permits should be reconsidered. While this exemption may have been advantageous in the beginning of the program to ensure that cleanups were timely, the states and EPA's permit programs have matured to the point where this may no longer be a benefit. Modernization of the program should include strengthening and clarifying the federal facilities compliance provisions of CERCLA. In implementing the cleanup provisions of CERCLA, it is imperative to ensure that both industry and government responsible parties are held to the same high standards. Recognizing that robust state cleanup programs have been developed and implemented in the 4 decades since the enactment of CERCLA, the program should also more clearly recognize that cleanups conducted under other cleanup authorities achieve results at least as protective as CERCLA actions. The states generally consider the nomination of a site for the NPL as a last resort, and only after exploring and exhausting all other available state and federal programmatic enforcement and incentive options to either motivate a recalcitrant PRP or entice a non-liable party interested in taking on the cleanup as a part of redevelopment. It is not wise to give the impression that only CERCLA cleanup actions are protective. By ensuring that CERCLA recognizes the merits of other programs, we increase the overall effectiveness and efficiency of cleanups regardless of the program under which they're conducted. States' concerns related to cost share, related to fund lead cleanup should also be addressed, including consideration of greater flexibility and credit for states in providing in-kind contributions to cleanups, which may be used to fulfill these cost contribution obligations. And modernization should include provisions to ensure that needed regulatory cleanup standards are developed and updated in an expeditious manner using sound science and the best information available. The program consists of at least 4 distinct components: the assessment and identification of releases, referred to as the preliminary assessment site investigation component, short-term removal actions, long-term removal actions conducted and funded by responsible parties, and long-term actions conducted by EPA using the trust fund. Many states have the resources and desire to play a greater role in the process, and when willing and able, those states should be encouraged to do so. Consideration should be given to authorizing states to directly implement both the PASI and the responsible party-led and funded removal and remedial components, which would add substantial capacity to the cleanup and decision-making authority of the program and free up precious federal resources to focus on those orphan sites and fund lead sites. In conclusion, states consider the Superfund cleanup program to be a vitally important tool for cleaning up our nation's contaminated sites and restoring and protecting human health and the environment. States have positioned themselves to be effective partners and co-regulators with EPA in implementing the cleanup program and look forward to working with EPA, Congress, and others in our collective efforts to continue to modernize and improve the effectiveness and efficiency of this program. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Porter, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
All right, good to be here. Let me see if I'm turned on here, am I? Can you hear me? Can you hear me okay?
Try again. No, I don't think it's, you lift it up maybe.
There we go. Can you hear me now, okay?
Yes, sir.
It's good to be here. I want to be very direct this morning. I used to run this program for a long time, and I was going to tell Mrs. Dingle that I spent a lot of time with her husband. I would certainly call him the father of Superfund.
We've all dealt with it.
We all dealt
Congressman Dingle.
And Mr. Oxley and many other people I've dealt with this committee. Anyway, I want to be very, very direct here if I can. I'm having private practice now, but I spend a lot of time in Superfund. I still spend a lot of time in Superfund. And I want to, unlike the 40 items that the previous speaker, Barry Breen's a good guy. I know him well. He's very smart. He's not in the position to make the kind of things you need to make this program going. You need someone who represents the president, and I'll talk more about that later. One of the things I want to mention is that, as several people have said today, the most important thing in Superfund, we got a lot of people who worked hard on the Superfund. EPA's got a lot of good people. The states have done a lot of good work. But the basic thrust today, Superfund costs way too much and does not nearly as much work as it should, period. That's my bottom line. Now, how do we improve this situation? By the way, I think we can do it. I've seen several assistant administrators who've done quite well. Others have not done so well. It's a tough job, and you need people who can really run this program. In fact, I would say the most important thing I can say to you today, I'll start out with, it's critical that the president put in someone in my old job or other assistant administrators. They have the ability to do it. They're authorized by law to make remedy selections. So if you really want to have a site that's not being done, you go to my old position, and that person has the authority in the circle of statute to make the decision. Otherwise, it's a huge committee process, a very large committee process. So it's critical, in my opinion, that the president appoint an assistant administrator to run the Superfund program on a day-to-day basis. He or she has the authority to make the key decisions and can run the projects. I don't mean I micromanage them all, but to be sure things get done and make the tough decisions. Excuse the name dropping, but I've talked to at least a dozen or so governors when I was there, many hundreds or dozens at least of people, congressmen, where you had to kind of get down to making a decision. And I think that's really critical that you get somebody who can do that. That person, in my judgment, should have a technical background, probably, is a good manager, understands the program, and is willing to make tough decisions, and is frankly a pretty good communicator. Let me go down to 3 or 4 things I want to present today, some of which you've heard, some of which you haven't. Probably the next most important thing is to set and enforce deadlines. One thing I used to do every quarter, I would send all 10 regional administrators, say, here's what we're going to finish this quarter. Give me a call, send your staff up if you don't make it. I grew up in the private sector where I ran large projects around the world, and I tried to treat this just seriously. So you set and enforce deadlines, and that's a key job of the assistant administrator, is to be sure we get these things done. When I tell the governor or I tell a member of one of these congressmen or senators that we're going to finish the site, we finish it. Love Canal, just a quick name we all know. I spent a lot of time with senior people in the state of New York. I spent a lot of time in Buffalo, et cetera. And a lot of time, Mr. LaFalce, who was a congressman at those times, when I said we're going to do it in a year and a half, we did it in a year and a half. I'm not the only one that can do that. Many people could do that. You just got to get the right people. Set and enforce deadlines, and particularly help with the selection of remedy. That's the key thing in this program, is what are we going to do here? I have a couple of sites, I may mention several. I won't not get into a lot of names here, but there have been sites where you've spent $100 million in 10 years and don't have a remedy. I'm not saying don't clean up the site. I'm saying don't even have a remedy. And these are fairly recent sites, and there's many others. One thing that's not been discussed today, and Mrs. Dingle might be interested in this from what she said, there's an A+ program in EPA called Emergency Removals and Early Actions. It's not done as well as it could be done, but it's when I was interviewed by a reporter when I left, said, what would you give? You give yourself an A on anything. I said, well, I get some B's and B minuses, but A+ is emergency removal program. And what that basically means is I and other people in the regions can agree to do something aside. They might say to me, can you give me a couple of $1 million to go out and these barrels are leaking and stuff like that. Very good program. In fact, one of the guys, I'll mention one name here, several people I know that have been in that position, and 1 or 2 of them became assistant administrators. They were very good because they were used to doing things quickly. So I think emergency removals are going to be important. Number 3, I wanted to take a little different tack on one issue. The term PRP, potentially responsible parties, has not been mentioned much today. Those are the companies or the cities or the other people who have to are caught up in this program. They're going to have to pay for it, et cetera. And that needs improvement. And I've talked to a lot of my industry colleagues out there about how I'm kind of concerned that many large companies, when they start a program like this, they immediately turn to their legal department. My dad was a lawyer. Many of you are lawyers. I have nothing against lawyers, but you need top managers to do this work. And the guy I talked to most at EP when I was there was the general counsel. He was extremely good, extremely helpful. He would always tell me, where do you want to get to and how do we get there? So it's important that the PRPs, the responsible parties, be dealt with, and they need to improve because they have the know-how. I don't need to necessarily tell a DuPont or a Monsanto or a AT&T how to run a project. But what I do need to do is say, you're going to pay for this. Let's do it in the most cost-effective way we can, and let's really get on with it. So I think that's something that hadn't been talked about enough. There's some real failure here in some cases of the companies involved to get serious, work with us, not listen only to their lawyers, but also to the engineers, and frankly, their senior management, that we want to get this thing done. It's a terrible PR problem, et cetera. One thing that has
Give me
also
your
been
last or
mentioned today-
quick, you're already over, so give
Okay,
me.
just going to say, I'd like to see us get rid of some of the things that are just a drag on us. Mr. Breen mentioned the Remedy Review Board. It's worse than nothing. It takes a lot of time and stuff, and they're nice people and all that, but it takes a lot longer. It's because of that one thing. So there's many other things like that, too.
That's the kind of testimony we like to hear. We appreciate your time. Chair now recognizes a gentleman from Oregon, Mr. McKenna. It's welcome. It's good to see you again, and you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Shimkus, Ranking Member Tonko, and members of the subcommittee, I thank you, and Governor Brown thanks you for providing this opportunity to provide testimony today on modernizing the Superfund program. Before I get into the details of the testimony, please allow me to convey a little bit of my background and my expertise in Superfund. I've been involved in Superfund sites for over 30 years, starting off as an environmental coordinator for NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, which in and of itself had a contaminated groundwater plume impacting the city of Pasadena water wells. Prior to joining Governor Brown's Natural Resource Policy Office, I was a private consultant, owned my own firm, doing primarily Superfund work. I know my time to testify is limited, so you have my written materials, so I'm going to kind of cut to the chase of the issues I want to bring forth in terms of improving the program. Any attempts to modernize or revamp the Superfund program should consider 4 existing principles. In other words, these are principles we wouldn't support changing in any way, shape, or form. And that is, number 1, the polluter pays principle, that the polluters each pay their fair share at the end of the day for the contamination and not put that burden on the public. Number 2, there could be no adverse impact or unjust burden placed on at-risk or underserved communities in the neighborhood of Superfund sites. In fact, we should be looking for ways to develop family wage jobs for those at-risk community members associated with the cleanup as the cleanup is progressing. See if we could actually do workforce development to get them involved in the cleanup, as well as the brownfield redevelopment sites post-cleanup. Number 3, there's no cookie-cutter approach to revamping Superfund. All these sites are very unique. Portland Harbor is a very large, mega complex site, and so the fixes for a Portland Harbor-like site are not necessarily going to be the appropriate fixes for smaller Superfund sites. We need to keep that in mind. There's no cookie-cutter approach. And number 4, any efforts to reduce or obviate the timely and meaningful input of the public and the Native American sovereign governments at these sites would not be acceptable to the state of Oregon. We have a very complex site. We have numerous community involvement. Community groups have been involved since the beginning in 2000. We have 6 Native American tribes, all sovereign governments that have been actively involved. The Nez Perce, Yakima, Warm Springs, Umatilla, Grand Ronde, and Siletz are all at the table. They need to be, there need to be seats maintained at that table for those parties to make sure that they have meaningful input in the process. So that being said, the state of Oregon has a list of proposed modifications to the program. Go through this list very quickly, and then I'm happy to answer questions at the end. We believe that we need to increase the funding for Superfund. That's been a part of the conversation here this morning. The Superfund program needs sufficient budget in order to ensure that there's adequate staffing and resources available at the headquarters and regional offices to push these NPL sites to closure. We need to reinstate a revenue source, the Superfund tax, to replenish the fund for the orphan sites. Again, a topic that has come up a number of times this morning. We need to have the orphan fund money available for those sites where there are no viable PRPs to do the cleanup. For mega Superfund sites, the complex ones like Portland Harbor, we think EPA should consider breaking those sites up into manageable areas. Some call them operable units or some form of smaller areas so you could attack the sites and get to cleanup sooner than later. And then for sites with numerous PRPs, again, focusing on the Portland Harbor site, we have 19 Superfund sites in Oregon, but obviously Portland Harbor is the most complex for a number of reasons. We have over 100 PRPs at that site. We recognize the difficulty of EPA negotiating one settlement offer with all of those PRPs at once. So we suggest that EPA develop tools to give the PRPs enough certainty that they can settle out their respective liabilities and move on with cleanup while maintaining the government's need for prudent reopeners of that cleanup. And then finally, accommodating flexibility in cleanup design at each specific location. So a site like Portland Harbor, where you got about 14 different cleanup areas, each one will be unique. Our record of decision, which came out in January of 2017, accommodates flexibility at each of these sites. We promote that so that you can consider the unique conditions at each location and the future land use and groundwater uses at those locations. I know I'm running out of time, but I'm happy to answer questions. I have a lot of other information to talk about in terms of Portland Harbor, in terms of brownfield redevelopment.
Very good, appreciate it. Thank you for your testimony. And now we'd like to turn to Ms. Debbie Manns. You're recognized for 5 minutes. And I'm very generous with the time, so don't feel too pressured. You know, we can go over.
Thank you. I just cut some more testimony, so I So good morning. Thank you for this opportunity to testify. Again, my name's Debbie Manns, and I'm the co-chair of the Passaic River Community Advisory Group, or CAG. And the CAG provides advice and recommendations to the EPA and its partner agencies to help ensure more effective and timely cleanup and restoration of the lower Passaic River. It's a construct of the Superfund law. In 2015, our CAG won the Community Involvement Award from the U.S. EPA, a national award that recognizes outstanding achievements in environmental protection. I'm also the executive director and baykeeper for New York, New Jersey Baykeeper, which works to protect, preserve, and restore the New York Harbor Estuary, which includes the lower Passaic River. And we hold the technical assistance grant for the Passaic River Superfund site. I'm here today to represent the communities that have been harmed by the pollution in the Passaic River. The site was first listed on the NPL in 1984, so I think we might win the bets here. Dioxin, PCBs, metals, PHs, and pesticides are found in the sediment of the lower Passaic River, and the primary polluter on the river was a company called Diamond Alkali, which produced Agent Orange during the Vietnam War, and they used to shovel the byproduct of that production, dioxin, off the bulkheads into the Passaic River. The Superfund site now consists of 17 miles of the Passaic River, Newark Bay, and other portions of New York Harbor. And over the years, the cleanup has progressed slowly along, primarily consisting of a constant back and forth negotiation between the PRPs and the EPA over sampling locations and methodologies, sampling results, newfangled ideas to clean the river, fish swaps, or recommendations to let the river heal itself. The recalcitrance of the PRPs was further amplified by the lack of funds to allow EPA to move forward with the cleanup itself due to the lapse of the Superfund tax. In March 2016, a record of decision was selected for the lower 8.3 miles of the river, the most contaminated section of the Superfund site and the source for ongoing contamination spreading throughout the New York Harbor Estuary. However, the remainder of the Superfund site, an additional 9 miles of waterway upriver and Newark Bay, is still under investigation. And recently, the Diamond Alkali Company, aka Upper Lower Passaic section, was listed as a Superfund site targeted for immediate and intense action by EPA Administrator Pruitt. This is the upriver portion of the Superfund site. This announcement, coupled with the May 2017 announcement by Administrator Pruitt revising EPA's delegation of authority to ensure that decision-making comes straight from the administrator to select remedies estimated to cost $50 million or more, and we will be over that amount, rather than the assistant administrator and the regional administrators, gives me pause. The May 2017 memo further states that as part of effectuating this adjustment to the remedy selection process, I ask that you involve the Administrator's Office early on and throughout the process of developing and evaluating alternatives and remedy selection. This would appear to add a layer of bureaucracy rather than make processes more efficient at EPA. Now the regional offices must involve EPA headquarters early and often throughout the process. Now, technical experts at the regional offices must confer with political appointees based in Washington, D.C. on developing and evaluating cleanup alternatives and remedy selections for sites. This makes no sense to the stakeholders on the ground. The people who know these sites the best are the local EPA technical experts who come to our community meetings and inspect the sites. My best guess as to why the Upper Passaic site is on the list of Superfund sites targeted for immediate and intense action is that EPA headquarters would like to test out adaptive management, a strategy outlined in the task force report, through the use of an early action being promoted by the PRPs. What concerns me is that the PRPs are potentially getting another chance to move forward with a concept that was early reviewed and rejected by the EPA due to lack of scientific basis and protections to public health. Now, under the guise of a task force report and new directives from the headquarters. Indeed, regional staff recently informed us that our CAG will be updated on this potential cleanup proposal at our February CAG meeting, and the proposal is also subject of an upcoming Contaminated Sediments Technical Advisory Group, CSTAG, meeting in Region 2. On a contaminated site like the Passaic River, it could be years before we understand how an early action has reduced public health risks, and by then, how will we ever bring the PRPs back to the table to finish a cleanup? One last point on the emphasis on reuse of Superfund sites. In New Jersey, we've had for several years a private sector program that our state agency delegates to private consultants to do cleanup of sites. It's called the Licensed Site Remediation Professional Program. And simply transferring a program like this over to sites that are Superfund sites would be inappropriate. Generally in New Jersey, Superfund sites are, as we talked about, the last result. And when they ask the EPA to take over sites that are very complicated or where the PRP is not cooperating. This LSRP program in New Jersey has actually resulted in less transparency and public engagement because the use of private consultants with less agency oversight results in less public participation and transparency. So I have the rest of my information in my written testimony. Thank you again for this opportunity.
Thank you. And now we'll turn to Catherine Prost, independent consultant. You're recognized for 5 minutes. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, members of the subcommittee, and thank you for inviting me to testify before you today. My testimony today is going to focus on 3 issues: improving the effectiveness of the Superfund remedial program, estimating the funding needs for the Superfund program, and the Superfund task force recommendations. The first question that must be asked, and this has already come up many times today from both Republicans and Democrats, is why does it take so long to clean up sites on the NPL? It's a great question, and it's really sad we don't have any answers. At the end of fiscal year 2016, there were 441 non-federal NPL sites that were not yet construction complete. Just over 40% of these sites were added to the NPL before fiscal year 2000. Some have been on the NPL since 1983. EPA needs to conduct an objective analysis to determine why these sites are still not construction complete in order to develop effective program reforms. Is the obstacle lack of funding, PRP inaction, bureaucratic morass, technical challenges, or something else? Until we know why these sites are taking so long, we really can't develop solutions. And it is worth noting that more than half of remedial actions at NPL sites are PRP lead. Much more attention needs to be paid to whether at some sites PRPs are in fact responsible for lengthy cleanup durations. Second, the agency needs to determine why there are still NPL sites where human exposure is not under control and what can be done about it. The most important goal of the remedial cleanup program is to protect public health. Yet, at the end of fiscal year 2016, there were over 100 non-federal NPL sites where human exposure was not under control, and at another 150 sites there was insufficient information to determine if it was under control or not. This issue should be the top priority of the Superfund program. Interestingly, the July 25, 2017 memo from Administrator Pruitt directs senior staff to, and I quote, prioritize and take action to expeditiously effectuate control over any site where the risk of human exposure is not fully controlled, close quote, and to provide a report that identifies these sites and describes where such risks are expected to be controlled within 60 days, which I think would have been the end of September. No information on this effort has been made public. To address this pressing issue, EPA should issue a report listing all non-federal NPL sites where human exposure is not under control, or where there is insufficient data to determine if it is under control, and detail what steps are needed to address potential exposure and when these actions will be implemented. Some have suggested that there is little or no need for a federal cleanup program and that the program should be delegated to the states. Yet few, if any, states have the financial resources to pay for the cleanup of an average NPL site, much less a mega site with costs of $50 million or more. In fact, states have increasingly raised concerns about their ability to come up with the funds to cover the state cost share for fund lead actions at NPL sites. To address this issue, EPA should commission an independent analysis of the financial resources and NPL cost burden for all states and territories that have NPL sites. As Congress seeks to improve the Superfund program, one key question, which again has come up this morning, is whether the program is receiving adequate annual appropriations to successfully carry out its responsibilities. EPA has not provided a public estimate of future funding needs to implement the program for many, many years. Congress should require that EPA issue an annual estimate of the future cost of completing work at all non-federal sites on the NPL. EPA should also develop an estimate of the amount needed for a PRP reserve fund. One of the important tools for EPA to get PRPs to agree to pay for and implement cleanups is the threat that if they don't, EPA will do so and then see cost recovery or potentially treble damages. For this threat to be real, EPA needs to have a sizable reserve fund to draw on, which is not the case. EPA should also investigate the potential savings of an optimal cleanup funding approach. Given the very real constraints on annual EPA funding for site construction, which was only $187 million for fiscal year 2017, it is almost certain that site cleanups are not funded in an optimal manner. This results in work at some sites being spread out over many years, likely increasing total costs. If an analysis of a different funding approach showed substantial cost savings, Congress could consider whether a few years of surge funding would be worthwhile as a mechanism to get some of the more expensive NPL site cleanups completed faster and at a total lower cost. Finally, as you know, in July, EPA issued a Superfund task force report with 42 recommendations. As of yesterday, there had been no public information on the implementation status of any of the recommendations except for the release in December of the list of the 21 sites targeted for immediate and intense action, and yesterday the release of a list of 31 sites with high redevelopment potential. Congress, the public, other interested parties, and most importantly, residents living near NPL sites have no information on the status of the many task force recommendations, nor on the impact of these recommendations on the day-to-day operations of the Superfund program. Neither has there been any information on exactly what it means to be included on the list of 21 sites targeted for immediate action. The lack of transparency is staggering. Thank you for asking me to testify before you today. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, and I'll recognize myself 5 minutes for the members' questioning. And Mr. Cobb, in your written testimony, you note that the National Contingency Plan should be updated, and you specifically suggest perhaps the National Contingency Plan should be revised to apply separately to cleanups funded by potential responsible parties, or PRPs, versus cleanups paid for by the federal government. Can you walk us through your suggestion for updates to the National Contingency Plan? And if you can do it quickly, I want to try to get to as many people as I can.
Yes, sir. I'd be glad to. Yes, first, the NCP was written almost 35 years ago. We've learned a lot since then. We need to update it for the lessons that we've learned. And related to the recognizing the difference between PRP-led cleanups and fund-led cleanups, recognizing that we have many PRPs who now get it, who want to be able to resolve their issues, want to be able to move forward and conduct cleanups, yet the NCP was written as though every site was going to litigation, every site was going to cost recovery, so it is very detailed. We need to make a difference there to enable sites and facilities that want to resolve their issues to be able to move forward quickly. That provides a greater incentive to encourage more sites to do that, and still reserves the detail for those sites that need to go through the trust fund type cleanup and cost recovery.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And for the panel as a whole, just as a statement, and I'm not sure where we as a committee can get to, I think a lot of you raised the issue in observing us. We're frustrated, takes too long, we're looking for recommendations. And if we, as members, could eventually decide on what the solution to that goal is together, we maybe can start writing something that would help update some of these records and files and timelines and stuff. So I would encourage a continued dialogue with us as we move forward. Back to Mr. Cog, and part of this debate is, do you think, and it was raised by other panelists, do you think that certain authorities under the Superfund Act could be delegated to states?
Yes, as I stated in my written testimony, I think that where responsible parties are willing and able to go forward with cleanup, states certainly have the expertise and the capacity to be able to do that. The advantage of that is it doesn't take away from EPA's actions under fund lead cleanups. In fact, it enhances them because it removes some of the decision-making and technical bottlenecks that we see of everything going through the federal project managers, through the federal decision makers, and frees up resources to be able to move sites faster through the process.
And so, I don't know if it's Ms. Manns, Ms. Prost, someone mentioned this. Ms. Manns, with your Passaic River issue, is there a problem with a proposal that some Superfund responsibilities be delegated to the states?
Well, the Passaic River, I mean, there's a close partnership with the state for that cleanup. I mean, it's one of the largest and most complicated in-water Superfund sites in the country, so I don't think that's an appropriate site to do that. I mean, the state of New Jersey has a lot of expertise in cleaning up contaminated sites.
So is it fair to say states wouldn't want a huge one, maybe even like the Portland area, but smaller ones that can be managed? Mr. McKenna?
Yeah, I think this is one of those issues where it's really state-specific and site-specific. In Portland, we have the Portland Harbor Superfund site, which is about 11 miles, and EPA is the lead for the in-water cleanup there. The state of Oregon is the lead for the in-water sediment cleanups immediately upstream of that, immediately adjacent and immediately upstream, because we need to control those sediment.
Because when I toured it, there was one site that was relatively remediated by the state.
Right.
Where all the surrounding areas, in essence, were not. If I remember that
that was
trip.
Cormac and Baxter, which is a separate Superfund site, and which it was an abandoned site, orphan site, federal funds, and the state implemented the cleanup there. The state also implemented the cleanup at sediment sites immediately upstream of the Portland Harbor Superfund site. And in that area where there were multiple cleanup sites, they dealt with each one separately and the PRPs of those sites separately. And they've actually got the cleanups done at the same cleanup goals as Portland Harbor, but they're actually done as opposed to the continuing work that's going on at Portland Harbor. So I think there are ways, and we're happy to sit down with anyone and talk about the lessons learned and some of the progress we've made in those areas.
Thank you. And Dr. Porter, I don't have time for a question, but I appreciate your blunt, straightforward analysis, and we look forward to working with you on ways if we get a decision to try to move forward on trying to at least clean up the process legislatively. So I'll yield back my time and turn to the ranking member, Mr. Tonko, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Manns, as I mentioned, I've been very concerned with transparency, the Superfund Task Force process, and the development of the administrator's targeted list. Did anyone at EPA engage with you before the Diamond Alkali site appeared on the administrator's targeted list?
No, we actually, subsequent to the listing, requested a meeting with the regional administrator, Peter Lopez, and we just met with him last week to ask more. We didn't really get much more information about what it means.
And are you going to continue to pursue to get information on that?
Yes, we will. I mentioned we are anticipating a proposal by the PRPs for that cleanup, for that portion that was put on the list next month. And then we'll have to turn around and provide technical comments on that on behalf of the community for the CSTAG meeting on March 1st.
Did EPA, for a little more clarification here, did they give any explanation to you as to what it means to have the site on the list?
No, they were as helpful as they could be, but it was just different variations of the word intense and immediate.
Okay. People can accuse me of cynicism if they want, but I do believe that this is a strategy for generating future press releases more than actually working toward remediating sites to the standard of protecting human health and our environment. So, Ms. Manns, can you explain the role that local stakeholders play in making a remediation successful?
Sure. Our CAG is very highly educated. We've been meeting since the fall of 2009, almost on a monthly basis. And we've done everything to provide advice on the community health and safety plan, the job training program. We created local jobs at our request on emergency action there, or initial cleanup, and as well as provide, like I said, technical advice to the department.
And how important is that engagement with and buy-in from the local community?
It's the most important thing you can have at a Superfund site. When the EPA announced the March in 2016 ROD, we had both senators, every single congressional representative in the region, the community, the mayor, all standing up to support that decision, and that's what made the difference.
Mm-hmm. Well, I will not argue with Dr. Porter that many cleanups could happen more quickly and more cost-effectively, but I really do believe a well-funded EPA is critical to get these cleanups done. Ms. Probst, has a lack of EPA funding caused a delay in starting some cleanups?
Well, as Barry Breen mentioned, we know from EPA's own data, I think it's 14 of the last 17 years, they've had to delay remedial actions you can document that. I think it's fair to say that if you listen to Mr. Carter or anybody who has a site, sites are taking a long time. One has to assume that the lack of actual funding for construction is causing EPA to spread things out over multiple years. That is much harder to capture. So all we know is these specific actions that have been delayed, but you have to assume that if you only have $187 million, which I would love to have personally, but is not a lot of money for this program for cleanups, for construction, that things are being parceled out over years. So we don't know exactly how much, but I think it's fair to say it contributes to the delay.
And can you explain how EPA needs both enforcement and cleanup resources in order to ensure responsible parties remediate these sites?
Sure, so, although I'm not a lawyer. But the enforcement program, the whole goal is that the responsible parties will actually pay for and implement cleanups themselves. In theory, they see that as an advantage because they assume they're more efficient than EPA, although one actually doesn't know that. But it's in their interest to have more control. So under the enforcement program, and usually we are talking settlements here, EPA works with the responsible parties and they implement, as Barry said, we think it's 60 or 70% of remedial actions. The other thing that's important that I mentioned in my testimony is EPA being able to step in if there's a site that has been sitting there for 5, 10, 15, or 20 years and the responsible party isn't doing anything. And there are at least 2 of the 21 sites on the list that it clearly says the PRPs have been sitting on this site. The idea is that EPA should have the funding to go in there and say, okay, PRP, there's been this remedial action ready to go for 3 years or 5 years. You're dragging your feet. Forget it. We're going to implement it. That's part of the program.
And just quickly here, Ms. Manns, I mentioned the issues facing the Hudson River this morning. It is clear how important it is to get the remedy right the first time. Can you explain how an insufficient assessment, poor sampling or modeling, or an incomplete cleanup will make it more difficult to make sites protective of human health and bring responsible parties back to the table?
Well, yeah, I mean, if you move forward with that type of thing, I don't see how you can bring them back to the table, especially years later for like a sediment thing, site, when you only then figure out decades later that the fish are not getting healthier and you're not reducing the cancer risk. The rod that we have now is a bank-to-bank dredging, and we look to what happened at the Hudson River with just the hotspot removal as, informing us about what should be happening for that river, and that's what concerns us about the upper river, and that maybe they'll try a hotspot removal solution.
Thank you so much. With that, I yield back, Mr.
Gentleman yields back. Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Carter, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Porter, I want to echo the comments of the chairman. I find your testimony to be quite refreshing, and I appreciate that. And I want to associate myself with you that I think it takes more than just throwing money at a problem than to cure it. And so often up here in Washington, we think that's the cure. If you can get enough money to it, then it's going to be solved. You obviously don't adhere to that advice, although I agreed that we probably do need to do better than what we are doing. I wanted to ask you've also in your testimony, I noticed that you said that nearly $100 billion that EPA has spent in public and private funds really is not proportional to the amount of work that's been done. You mentioned in your testimony the need to move the site remediation decisions to the key subordinates of the secretary. Can you elaborate on that? Is that going to help? Is it going to make it more timely? How's that going to work?
Well, I think you've got a very important project here where you've got to get people who, the key people are the administrator who spends some time out, and I'm very happy the administrator at least is putting a focus on this thing. I've not seen too many administrators spend this much time in Superfund, so that in itself is kind of interesting. But below that, you got my old job, which is the National Program Manager, who can actually make remedy decisions, him or herself, and then you've got the 10 regional administrators, and you've got the Superfund chiefs in the region. They're all important. So I think it's important. What I'm trying to do is, frankly, I'm very disappointed in recent years, or quite a few years actually, that the management of the projects has been sitting lower and lower and lower at EPA. More and more committees, more and more whatever. So I think that's important. I also want to point out that the remedy itself is critical. I've seen sites with a $50 million remedy, $800 million remedy, or $2 billion remedy. You know, and it isn't that the 500 million is 5 times as good as the 10 or the 20. They're just different. For example, the comment just here recently about, and I'm familiar with all these sites, of the Passaic River and the Hudson or whatever, and maybe hotspot removal is better than wall-to-wall dredging of the river, which is billions of dollars. And so I think it's important that you have a lot of judgment brought in. And by the way, the first thing in the statute of this law back in Mr. Dingell's day is that the president shall pick, meaning people like me, the president shall pick a cost-effective remedy. A cost-effective remedy. That means a good remedy has 9 other criteria that go in there. And so I think it's very important to have the people at pretty senior things, mainly at the region. I want the region to go as far as they possibly can. Most sites they can handle. But when they can't handle the site or they want help, someone like in my old job has got to get in there and help them. And frankly, maybe even say, I think we ought to do this, not that. I had lots of time in the early days of Superfund of having regions come in and talk to me about that. Here's the site we're going to do. And I won't get into a lot of detail, but I'll say, I would ask them the following 5 or 6 questions. For example, real simple one. You say EPA is going to do this. Well, you know that Mr. Dingell, et cetera, put in there, which is good, that the state shall pay, if we EPA have to pay for it, the state has to pay 10%. Does Oklahoma have 10%? Just to pick a name at random. And the answer often is no. So you have to be careful. And I would say, well, wait, so back to the remedies for the PRPs will do it. Well, they'll do it. They'll do the $80 million remedy, but they won't do the $90 billion remedy. It had nothing to do with the cost. It's just they'll go to court over that. You then ask the people in the area, well, do you want the $90 million remedy or the $80 million remedy? So no, we don't want to be moved out of our houses. I can think of that Love Canal as a good example of things like that kind of dialogue would happen all the time. So it takes a lot of judgment with these 9 criteria, and that judgment needs to be held pretty high. And the reason I'm telling the president or anybody else here, listen, get my old job filled with a full-time person who has a lot of savvy and help you and help the regions and help everyone else, Democrats and Republicans, because the remedy itself, I've seen sites all over the place where you're going along thinking it's $200 or $300 million. Next thing you know, it's $1 billion. And that doesn't mean that's good or bad. It's just, let's think, guys. The law says you pick a cost-effective remedy and a bunch of other things. So what we don't need is bureaucracy. What we now have is a lot more bureaucracy than in my day.
Let me just real quickly, Dr. Porter. So do you believe states ought to have more authority or less?
I in my testimony, written testimony, I think one of the things I said, I think looking down the road a ways, I think the states should do most of this work. The states, I've looked at a lot of sites around the country, and what I find in general, the states, for similar sites, not a bad site and a not so bad site, but those kind of sites, the states, the good, quotes, good states that have really good programs are usually about 1/3 the cost and much faster.
Okay, but Ms. Prost, you mentioned in your testimony that you didn't think the states could do it?
Well,
Are they not qualified? They don't have the money or what?
I think we're talking a little bit vaguely. Right now, there is nothing that precludes states from cleaning up sites that aren't on the MPL. And if you listen carefully to the testimony from Mr. Cobb, they want the states that don't involve a lot of funding. They want the PRP lead sites. So I don't really know what's being recommended. There's nothing that precludes state, I mean, a site only gets on the MPL if the state concurs. That's not legal, but that's basically the policy. So it's not that EPA is adding sites to the MPL without the state agreement, so I'm not actually sure what's being recommended. But it is true that states don't have a lot of financial capability. They're upset about the 10% cost share, so I think that whatever recommendations you get on the states, it needs to be clearer. I don't know what's being recommended here, and so I don't know if they want more NPL sites or what they want.
Right. Well, thank all of you for your work, and I yield back.
Yeah, excellent work. Chair, and I recognize Ranking Member Full Committee, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to say I'm happy to have Debbie Manns here because she's really a fierce advocate for the environment in New Jersey and has a wealth of experience with the Superfund program. But I wanted to follow up, Debbie, on the issues raised by Mr. Tonko. I have several Superfund sites in my district, and stakeholders at those sites have called me to ask why they weren't included on the list. I know we have many lists now, and they wonder if that means their sites are now headed to the back of the line. As I stressed in my questions to Mr. Breen, the focus of the Superfund program has been and should remain protecting human health and the environment. I mean, obviously you agree with that, yes?
Yes.
Okay, but let me ask you, do you have concerns that the recent EPA actions have the potential to shift EPA attention and cleanup funds away from the riskiest sites?
I think in the current state of, almost a third of the budget being cut at EPA, what's going to happen is you're going to do less with less. That you just can't do more with less. And so, yeah, priorities will be shifted and choices will have to be made. And I think inevitably it'll result in slowdowns at other cleanup sites.
Okay. Now, I'm particularly concerned about yesterday's publication of a list of Superfund sites with the highest potential for economic redevelopment, which is a factor that is not really relevant to the risk posed by the site. The Passaic River was or was not on that last list?
I did not get a chance. I'm still looking at the list from December 8th, so I'm not sure.
All right. So, but of course, my understanding is that the Passaic River is not going to be redeveloped for industrial use. So, I mean, that doesn't make the cleanup less important.
Right. I mean, on the Passaic River, the community's been perfectly clear what they want to see for the river. They want waterfront parks, boat ramps, habitat, clean water where if you catch a fish or a crab, you will not get cancer, or that it's illegal to do that. I mean, that's what the community wants for their river.
Yeah, and as you say, the community often is the most knowledgeable. I'm not saying they're the only factor, but certainly the most knowledgeable. But then, I mean, it's not true that because the site may not be redeveloped that there aren't significant economic benefits from doing the cleanup, right? I mean, you still see significant economic benefits to what you're proposing, even if it's not redeveloped.
Right. The proposed cleanup for the lower 8.3 miles includes a channel, which has not been dredged for 40 years. So we took commercial interests in account for the cleanup. But yeah, there's a new waterfront park in Newark. The third phase was just open last month. That's what's going to drive revitalization in our communities, is places where people want to go, open space, and where businesses know that will attract their employees.
I mean, see, that's my concern. In other words, you have a site that will be cleaned up, will be much more open to recreational uses. It won't be it won't be, primarily focused on manufacturing, but that's the very thing that actually may bring more people and economic activity to Newark or to the area. I mean, that's essentially what I think you're saying.
Yes.
All right. I don't have a lot of time, so I just wanted to ask one more thing. You raised it in your testimony, and this comes up all the time, that that recent actions by the EPA could undermine the quality of the cleanups done, okay? Can you explain why you fear the recent EPA recommendations and target lists could lead to weaker or less effective cleanups?
Right. Well, we'll find out more about this next month at the CAG, but our understanding is that the PRPs plan to propose a cleanup for the upper 9 miles that sounds like it will be a hotspot removal. Sounds a lot like their prior proposal for a sustainable remedy that was earlier rejected by the EPA when we were looking at alternatives for the cleanup. So it's a big concern, and the directives from the headquarters at EPA, not the regional staff, which have been really amazing, leaves us with concern.
You see, that my concern is that that this task force report and the subsequent targeted list could lead to inadequate cleanups and not robust cleanups that are really protective of human health and the environment. And the mission of the Superfund program is to protect human health and the environment. So if you do these meaningless cleanups that don't actually address that, then
You
we're
don't
not
have a Superfund
accomplishing the
program.
goal. Right.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much. I appreciate you being here.
Gentleman's time expired. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Wahlberg, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the panel for being here. Mr. Cobb, in your written testimony, you discussed the modernization of the corrective action program of the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act that happened in the 1990s. What could we learn from that process that can be applied to modernization of the Superfund today?
Mr. Walgren, I believe what we can learn from that process is many of the things that I outlined in my testimony about enabling sites with facilities that understand their liability now and want to resolve it, enabling them to move forward. Back in the late 90s, 2000s, I was actually one of the voices against that kind of action because I believed that the more prescriptive requirements that RECRA was using up until that time were to our benefit. I'm happy to say today that I've been proven wrong on that because as RECRA was redesigned to be more flexible in allowing sites to move forward in targeting interim actions such as Dr. Porter described earlier and making quicker decisions, we've been able to get more sites cleaned up faster. Facilities have recognized that if they're willing to work with us, they can get through the process faster and more economically and still arrive at a very protective cleanup.
And so that's the enabling you're talking about?
That's the enabling, yes. We have to recognize that, as Mr. Breen testified earlier, only about 30% or so of the sites on the NPL require fund lead activity. Most of them are PRP lead. And there are many other sites that are not on the NPL that are also conducted as CERCLA cleanups. Currently, the way the statute is written, all of those decisions, all of that review is under EPA authority. None of it is delegable to the states, although the states work cooperatively with EPA on those things. What I'm proposing is that by opening that up and giving states a broader role, that we increase the throughput capacity of the program. We enable sites that want to move forward and get cleanup done, and then we're able to focus more resources on those recalcitrant sites or the orphan sites and be able to apply the full force of the Superfund liability scheme on those sites, which creates a greater incentive for sites to come forward voluntarily to help us out. This has worked in RECRA. We've been able to move thousands of sites through the process much more quickly, and I believe it will work in the Superfund program as well.
So it's not a fix-all, but it does narrow the scope. I mean, we think of the Gelman site, for instance, which seems to drag on.
And down.
And on.
And down.
Can we start this song together? That would be one where we're not seeing that efficiency, speed, and creativity in completing the process.
That is correct, and if I could venture to say that, as has been discussed by the committee, there are issues with cleanups being funded limited, but one of the things we in the states have learned through the years is that we've got to streamline our processes. For those things that we do and do well, we've got to make those as efficient as possible to be able to wisely use the funds that we do have, and then make sure we have the available funds to do the work we need to do.
And then make sure that states have the funds. And I think that is a crucial point that we have to remember up here. Thank you. Dr. Porter, what are some actions EPA could take to improve Superfund cleanup program? Are there changes to the statute that need to be made and taking in consideration of making them more effective and efficient?
Yeah, I think one of the things to think about is, in my statement, I believe I've mentioned 3 things that might be worthy of legislation. One is to actually increase funding of the removal and early action programs, because we've done thousands and thousands, we EPA, of actual short-term things. So what I'm saying, instead of having $1 million that you can go out and pick up barrels or whatever, let's make it $3 or $4 million, because those are very effective. First off, you do things directly, like picking up barrels or whatever, you learn a lot for the next step. And what we tend to do, we EPA tend to do, is we go on and on and on, thinking about every conceivable thing. There's a lot of sites where something can be done. A company may come forward and say, look, I'll spend $100 million on, or $20 million or $10 million on this fairly quickly. The Passaic people have done that. They've offered to do things in other places. And that often just ends up in lots of dialogue forever and ever and never gets done. The second thing I did, unlike Mr. Dingell in his day, and I was very supportive of his the statute, but in that statute many years ago, it was a lot of stars. You shall do 250 studies. You should do 513 of this. We met all those. That was fine. I want to see things that are ending, like, for example, how long will it be before you have a remedy? You're starting, the site's put on the site, and by law, and you can always tweak it a little bit if you're the top person. In 2 years, you shall have a remedy. Or maybe it's like, in 1 year, I'd like to see in the statute, in a new statute, to say, after 1 year, the EPA needs to tell us what the likely remedies look like, or what are the things you can do immediately. So I think there's things like that you could do.
Well, thank you. Thanks for the pertinent advice.
Everything needs a date on it.
Yeah. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman's time expired. Chair recognizes gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. EPA's recent recommendations for reforms in the Superfund focus on sites with viable, responsible parties without paying much attention to the orphan sites that need public funds to be cleaned up. In fact, when Administrator Pruitt was here last month, he told us that there wasn't really very many orphan sites and they didn't require a lot of funding. I've asked him to provide an exact number of how many orphan sites are on the NPL for the record of last month's hearing, but I'm still waiting for that. Good example, we have a huge one that has a responsible party, but in the Houston area, southeast Texas, we have a number of them. One of them is in our district. It's an oil tanking facility that's been there for at least many, many years, and there is a responsible party, but they've absconded. They went to Latin America somewhere. So that would, I hope, would be included in an orphan site because it's EPA staff working on it as best they can. Ms. Provost, what have been the consequences of this sharp decline in the funding for the Superfund cleanup since the year 2000?
It's really hard to tell, frankly, without doing any analysis. I mean, I think I don't really have an answer, and I guess I would just say that, one of the things that has plagued the Superfund program for a very long time, it's not just this administration, is there hasn't been an estimate how much funding they need. There hasn't been an effort to pinpoint what the problems are. If we don't pinpoint what the problems are, I don't care who you are, you can't solve them. So I actually can't tell you because numbers, like the number of sites, well, sites are heterogeneous. There's a $5 million site, there's a multiple $100 million site. So it's a very good question, and I can't give an answer.
Well, and that's many administrations. It's not just the current one or previous, but since 2000. And I've been out on that site, and this is just barrels of toxic substances, crude oil mainly, sitting out in the rain, rusting, and every once in a while they'll come in and move some of them. But they're still the site, and there's that land is fairly valuable both for industrial or commercial purposes where it's at. Do you believe that the funding for cleanups of orphan sites is an essential component of the Superfund program?
Absolutely. And can I just say one thing about that? It is true that only some percent are orphan sites, but again, you need the threat of bringing things back from responsible parties, and the numbers flip in terms of the percent that are done by the fund in the earlier stages. The RIFS, the site study stage, tends to be done by EPA to get things moving. So it's not that a PRP site has no direct costs to EPA.
Okay. And Ms. Mans, do you agree?
Yes.
When you were talking about, by the way, the recovery there, that one site that we're working on still, that was a dioxin facility, people are still crabbing and fishing off of that. And I wish we could turn it into a touristy place, but I have an industrial area, and I think what'll take over there is barging operations, because that's the growth in that area of that the San Jacinto River there, where it enters the Houston Ship Channel. Ms. Provost and Ms. Mans, is the federal funding also essential for sites with responsible parties, because it allows EPA to move ahead with cleanups where the responsible parties are hesitant, let's call it?
Yes.
Okay. Also, what do you believe would be the consequences if EPA's budget request last year for tragic cuts in Superfund enforcement accounts were to go into effect?
Well, that just means everything is going to be paid for by the taxpayers. I mean, if you don't have if you don't have enforcement, you don't have PRP lead sites, what you're saying is that all your sites are going to be paid for by the federal government.
Okay.
We, just on some numbers, we were crunching them. The Trump administration proposed cuts to the Superfund program of 25% nationally, which would result in the loss of 536 staff slots.
Well, and Mr. Chairman, I have other questions, but I know it's time for us to leave, but you know, it's frustrating that what we see that that our own budget process now, that how do we run the Department of Defense, much less the EPA, with what we're doing now. But I'll yield back my time.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back his time. Chair now recognizes the other force of nature on the committee, Ms. Dingle, for 5 minutes.
I've behaved today. It's great to see all of you, and I thank you for sitting here. And Dr. Porter, I will tell the other Dingle that you referred to him many times today. It'll make his day. But I'm again going to go off script. But Dr. Porter, you were talking about how we should have remedies. But when we do remedies, do we have, and the timeline, do we have the cost associated with them? I mean, one of the things that I've really learned, it is taking far too long to even make the national priority list when you know someone should be on it. How do we, do we have the dollars we need to, when you try to put that timeline on a remedy?
Yeah, I think so. You know, I think there's such a broad range of things. For example, a lot of the sites you're talking about that should be on the list or not be on the list, I'm a big believer in putting a fair amount of money into, well, what about we go out and deal with it this afternoon? We've done thousands of things where someone has something that you could do fairly quickly. And the other big thing...
So why can't we do that? Because it's become such a bureaucracy.
Yeah. I don't think it's so much bureaucracy. The guy that did a great job was Tim Fields. He was in the Clinton administration. He came out of the removal program. Then he had my job a few years later. Tim would spend $1 million here, $2 million here, $5 million there. I would okay a lot more than sometimes than we had to. And he would clean up sites. Now, obviously, if something is going to be $500 million, it takes a little longer. But I think there's a lot of ways to be more creative. I would like to see more money put in these more straightforward projects where you can just go out and do it. Because there was a guy, just real quickly, a guy in Region 4. For a long time, back in the old days, we had cleaned six cleaned up sites. You saw it in the Washington Post every day. I had one guy who cleaned up 6 in 3 months. When I told the 10 regional administrators, got to get off this 6 cleaned up. Way back when. One guy goes back to Atlanta and he did 6 sites by himself, so to speak. And the reason he did it, he was creative. He said, well, first off, I'm not going to bring in Army Corps of Engineers here because we can do this with a removal program, and on and on and on. So I think there's a lot of creativity you can use, and sometimes maybe a little constraint on money is not all bad, but I want to see people that can actually think hard about what's a better way to do it. All these sites, are, as you may have heard me say earlier, they have huge, I did a quick site, not a quick site, a big site, I worked on in my private practice. It was the Department of Energy, it had a $100 million remedy and a $9 billion remedy. Well, there's one of the 9 criteria here, you have to pick an implementable site. It's not implementable to get Congress to get $9 billion. I'm just making this up, but not totally. So I think there may well need more money, but I'd like to see more money thrown where it's going to do some good. Well, because let me say real quick.
Okay,
You
'cause I gotta ask
you-
Dr.
You can take out a lot of money on this budget, it might not doing stupid things, excuse the expression, like remedy review boards that go around and take all kinds of time reviewing things which the region should have done.
Okay, so let me go to Ms. Mans and Ms. Prost at the same time. So an analysis by the Government Accountability Office found that only 27% of the new remedial action projects were funded in fiscal year 2013 compared to 100% in 1999. Could both of you answer the Ms. Mans and Ms. Prost, can you highlight some of the serious consequences we face, both in terms of public health and the environment, if we don't fund these Superfund programs annually at a robust level, or if it keeps going, significant cuts?
Well, yes, thank you. I just want to say I did hone my advocacy skills in your district, born and raised.
I know, I was going to tell, and her cousin is John Dingle's, John Dingle. Unfortunately, he died 2 weeks ago, but
So,
George Mans is a great man.
With the time. I mean, public health is at risk. We have people coming down to the river and catching fish and crabs that have dioxins in them, and it's unacceptable. And that's what we're dealing with.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really informative to look at the very limited amount of money that actually goes to cleanup in the Superfund budget. So when you're talking about these cuts I mean, I'm very grateful I don't live near a Superfund site. My daughter lives sort of near the Gowanus site. I'm a little bit less grateful about that. But I think, it's easy for us who aren't living near these sites, but if you're living there and if you have children or if you do subsistence fishing or if you want to walk around New Bedford Harbor, which there's no way to enforce the institutional controls, I assume all the contaminated waterways are that way. There are over 100 sites where human exposure is not under control, and there could be 250 sites where their human exposure not under control.
And local communities are being hurt by this.
And local communities are therefore at risk. I mean, the first thing the administration ought to do is put out that list of sites, which you can do from the website, but that should be the top priority.
Well, I'm out of time, and he was going to give me more, but I know it's what I want to say is I hope we'll all work together. My colleague, Mr. Wahlberg, works with me on the dioxin plume, which gets totally caught up in bureaucracy between two communities want a Superfund site, two communities are in court. It's been 50 years, and it's spreading, and it's not getting cleaned up. Like yesterday, the Supreme Court upheld that the original polluter has to maintain responsibility. But it's the local communities that and people who are scared about what's going to happen. So I hope, Mr. Chairman, and my other remaining colleague, we can all work together to make sure we're getting robust funding, and it's a priority for all of us in this country.
Well, I thank the gentlelady, and of course, it's been a good hearing. But before we dismiss this panel, obviously Chairman Walden is from Oregon, and Congressman Schrader is a member of the full committee. Of course, I got a chance to go out to Portland and tour that site a year ago. So everybody else had multiple things to be able to say, and we want to make sure that we've given you a chance based upon what you've heard to weigh in any response to some of this debate.
Oh, Mr. Chairman, I truly appreciate that. A couple things. One, I think when we talk about state involvement and leveraging some state resources, I think it's definitely worth looking into. But I think we have to evaluate that under two different buckets. One is if you have a site where there's no money for the cleanup and public monies need to be spent first and then seek reimbursement through legal action. That would be very difficult for a state like Oregon to take on a site like Portland Harbor that's $1 billion plus and take on that risk. But at Portland Harbor, we have the PRPs who have stepped forward to do the work, and they are paying not only for the studies and the cleanup, but they pay the state and federal government oversight costs. So in situations like that around the country, I think we should look at leveraging state resources to bring more expertise to the table and help move these projects forward quicker. I think the other issue, and Dr. Porter touched on this a bit, but I think for the early actions at these Superfund sites, when you come to a site and you recognize that there's a problem and something needs to be done now, there are PRPs who are willing to step forward and do some early action, but there's also concern from the public that that quick early action becomes the final action. I think we need to develop, and the state is more than happy, I have it in my talking points, of sitting down and talking about ways where PRPs like Northwest Natural and Portland Harbor who want to step forward and do the work can do it. And they stepped forward and did early actions back in 2004 and 5, recognizing that the ROD was going to take longer to get to. So they stepped forward and did the early action, recognizing that they were probably going to have to come back later and do more work. And I think if the PRPs recognize that, then more PRPs will step forward and do early action work.
If I can follow up, but the PRPs who volunteer will probably want to make sure that people know that they did some early action and get some credit for at least being involved early. Would you say that that would be true?
Yeah, I would, yes.
Okay. Well, again, I think this is very important hearing, a very difficult topic. Thank you for your answering the questions, your testimony, and we'll stay in contact. And with that, the hearing is adjourned.
Okay. Good job. Good job. Yeah, it's good.
No, I